I welcome you all and make the floor open for a meaningful discussion and deliberations on challenges to peace, security, and international law in South Asia, keeping in mind the sensitive border issues between the neighbors, change of regime in Afghanistan, continuous replacement of constitution in Nepal, and foreign policy of China, etc. Some issue which is very important today is, can we take the plea today that these are our domestic issues? Can we take the plea that these are our private problems not having any impact on others? Or do we live as a global community, as a global family, where each member has an impact on the other? I welcome you all to this strategic webinar and extend my best wishes and blessings for a meaningful, a successful, and a brainstorming and an interactive day ahead. All the best, all my blessings. And with these words, I formally, if you say inauguration, inaugurate the national webinar. Thank you all. God bless you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your welcome address and gracing this occasion with your presence, and most importantly, highlighting the key points of today's one-day national webinar on challenges to peace, security, and international law in South Asia. Thank you, ma'am, for extending all your support for conducting this one-day national webinar. With this, I hand over this platform to webinar director, Dr. Narendra Agrawal, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yadav. Now I wish to invite our first speaker, Dr. Srinivas Burra. He is the prominent voice of international legal study in South Asian University, and he has done extensive work in this particular area. And Srinivas, Dr. Srinivas is one of the speaker who extensively work in this particular area, especially the issue of international humanitarian law, international law of diplomacy, international environment law also. So he will speak on the latest development in Afghanistan and its implications in this webinar. So, sir, we wholeheartedly welcome you, and over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Narendra, for your introduction. And also I thank Professor Alka Acharya and Dr. Anita and other colleagues at the faculty, law faculty at the Delhi University for inviting me to this webinar. So I was asked, I think the time is given is roughly around 40 to 45 minutes, which is quite longer one. So I'll try to reflect on a few legal issues which have, of course, political implications as well, particularly in relation to Afghanistan since 15th of August, from when Taliban, in a de facto sense, took over the power in Afghanistan. But as rightly pointed out by Professor Alka Acharya, in fact, there are several developments which have been taking place in South Asia, especially in relation to conflict-related matters. Those who are students of international law, most of the issues in and around international law in relation to conflict matters in terms of upholding the human rights, humanitarian laws, questions of refugees, and the question of security matters. These are issues which in fact are concern for international law students in relation to any part of the world. And more importantly, in relation to South Asia, if you look at it, either some countries have come out of the conflict like Sri Lanka, Nepal, and or there are some states which are in fact are undergoing conflict like Afghanistan, which probably ended for some time in a formal sense, but again the conflict continues to happen in the last 3 months or so. So there are several legal issues involved in it, which are important for international lawyers in relation to Afghanistan, which includes the questions of human rights, humanitarian laws, humanitarian consequences that are happening, particularly in relation to refugees, but also some fundamental issues in relation to the existence, the legal nature of the existence of a government in a state like Afghanistan now and its legal status. Though I try to focus more on legal aspects of it, but I believe that they are equally important for political considerations. Two other speakers, my co-panelists, Professor Gilbert and Professor Uma, might be reflecting on the political aspect of these issues. So let me start with, I'll try to make, during my 40 minutes or so presentation, I'll try to reflect on four aspects, particularly on matters relating to international law, but they equally have implications to the political aspects of the current regime in Afghanistan. These four issues include, of course, there has been a lot of discussion around the issue of recognition of Taliban government. This is one issue which, of course, is a political one as well as the legal issue. That is one issue which I would like to reflect on. The second aspect is the status of Afghanistan government currently in relation to international organizations, particularly the United Nations, because that is what the subject matter of discussion in the last 2 months or so, when the United Nations General Assembly was happening. So the discussion as to who would be representing Afghanistan in the United Nations. So that is one issue which is closely linked to the question of recognition. That I'd like to reflect on that. The third issue that is equally important is, in fact, there is not much of discussion among international lawyers as well as international relations experts, is the agreement that was entered into between United States and Taliban that happened in early 2020. In fact, this is the agreement in a major way paved the way for what has happened from August, what has been happening from August 2020 onwards. So the ground was already set through an agreement strangely entered into between a state, that is United States, and a non-state actor, that was Taliban. That time it was a non-state actor, it was not a state entity, without even any participation from or presence from the side of then Afghanistan government. So that is one important aspect, which is an agreement, which is an important agreement, but seems to have not drawn much of an attention from both international lawyers and international relations experts. So that is third aspect. The fourth aspect is more to do with human rights and humanitarian laws, and the accountability in conflict-related violence that takes place in any conflict situation, particularly the role of the International Criminal Court in relation to Taliban's current regime. But actually, the International Criminal Court has taken note of, or the matter relating to Afghanistan has been there on the agenda of International Criminal Court for the last 7-8 years, from 2017 onwards, because Afghanistan had become a party to the Rome Statute in 2003. So the recent developments are a reflection of what has been happening in relation to Afghanistan and ICC. That is more to do with conflict-related violence and violations of international human rights and humanitarian law. So that is the fourth aspect I would like to reflect on. Moving from there, maybe at the end, I'll try to briefly say what role ahead, or what kind of position that India can take as a neighbor to Afghanistan, which is part of South Asia, particularly in relation to diplomatic relations or engaging with Taliban government. So these are the four major issues, with a few comments on India's position, or what India can think of in relation to Afghanistan. I would try to reflect on these issues, starting with the question of recognition of Taliban government. So this is one issue which has been in discussion in the media as well as among experts, is that whether Taliban government is recognized by the international community, that is community of states, or not. It looks like, I think so far, no state has formally recognized. If I go by the media reports, no state has formally recognized Taliban government, despite the fact that some states are still maintaining their diplomatic relations, either by way of engaging with the current regime, either in capital Kabul, or in other parts of the world, like in China, in Doha, and other places, where the leaders of other governments engaging with Taliban has been happening. But more importantly, the question has been whether Taliban government can be formally recognized, and what are the implications of recognition. Why so much of emphasis on recognition by the governments? So for students of international law, I think it is a known, a textbook kind of an information to speak in terms of recognition of an entity at the international level. We, as students of international law, focus more on the recognition of states. That is where the focus of international law is. Recognition of government is equally important, but the more attention is given to state. But when it comes to the question of Afghanistan's recognition, actually, it is not the question of recognition of the state. State of Afghanistan exists. I don't think anybody doubts the existence of Afghanistan as a state. The only doubt that arises is that which is the government or a formally elected government which is holding the power in Afghanistan. This kind of a situation is not new. The same situation is happening with Myanmar now after the military coup has taken place. And these things do happen at the international level where there is a transition, especially when there is a military coup or a change of government in a sudden manner happens. There is always a confusion that which is the legally or legitimate government representing a particular state. So it is not the question of the recognition of the state, but it is a question of recognition of government. And very interestingly, in fact, the recognition of government does not quite often happen. Means that whenever there is a change of the government, other countries do not recognize formally, or they do not make a statement saying that they are recognizing the government. That doesn't happen. Like every time the governments do change, every 5 years or so, even in a democratically elected system. So therefore, the other states don't every time make a statement saying that whether they recognize the new government or not. Then why does that happen in the case of Afghanistan? The reason why that has become an issue now is that that was also an issue to the previous regime of when Afghan government was functioning from 1996 to 2001. That time also there was an issue as to whether Afghanistan was recognized or not. There were only 3 countries, in fact, which recognized the previous Taliban regime, that is from 1996 to 2001. That was Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and I think UAE. These were the only 3 countries which recognized Taliban government from 1996 to 2001. So the same question would come now as to whether which are the countries which are formally recognizing. It looks like so far no country has formally made that statement. So as I said, that why this question becomes important, the recognition of its government, because every time states do not declare whether they are recognizing the government or not whenever there is a change in the government. Then if that is the case, then why that issue is so important for Afghanistan? The reason why that seems to have attained importance in the case of Afghanistan is that whenever there is a change of the government, particularly by force, there the question arises whether there is an adequate recognition of that government by other states for the purpose of maintaining diplomatic bilateral relations. Now that is where the issue becomes important in terms of recognizing the government. So in a normal routine manner, if there is a change of the government, the question of recognition does not arise much. So that is the reason why there is not much of a discussion even among international law sections as to what are the ways and means of recognizing a particular government. So it happens only when the military coup takes place or when there is a by force, there is a change of government because the existing, what quote unquote, relatively formally elected government has been overthrown through force and the new government takes over. So in those situations, it also becomes the question of legitimacy for those governments, new governments, which came to power through force, whether they enjoy adequate diplomatic recognition or diplomatic status by other states. That is where the question of recognition comes in. Now, based on what a state recognizes a government like Taliban, whether it could be Myanmar, Taliban, or any other government, that more or less is the same formula one can apply. What are the conditions under which a state can extend recognition to a newly taken over government by force or by military coup? The general understanding is that effective control, that for international law students, it is a known thing that there is something called an effective control exercised by the government of the day. Means that mainly maintaining the law and order situation, taking the entire territory under control in terms of the day-to-day governance part of it. So for that purpose, whether one can argue that whether Taliban holds holds the position of controlling effectively the entire territory of Afghanistan. It looks like the reports do say that there is an opposition to it. But if you, in a relative sense, if you look at it, probably uh, the current position of Taliban is probably more effective than what it was between 1996 and 2001 in terms of maintaining effective control over its territory and its government. I'm not saying that in an absolute sense, Taliban government is able to control the entire territory as of now. That is at least not the case. But going by the report, at least going by the resistance that comes, I think during 1996 and 2001, probably I think Northern Alliance was putting more powerful resistance than what it is today. At least there is no effective, coordinated, organized resistance happening as of now in terms of armed resistance to the Taliban regime now. That is one factor probably needs to be taken into consideration before talking in terms of extending recognition to the Taliban. That is one situation. The second aspect that probably is equally important is that in the near future, there does not seem to be any major intervention or major intervention both in diplomatic, in political, and military sense happening from external sources, that is, community of states, regional organizations, or the UN, to change the system in Afghanistan. In other words, the foreign forces have left. I don't think there is a possibility of the forces coming back again immediately by way of removing the government that sits today. In terms of the political processes, which probably would engage with Taliban, nothing major seems to be happening, because at least at the UN level, of course, bilateral level, informal level, things surely might be happening that probably diplomatic community would be knowing much better. But in a formal sense, at the UN level, no major development has taken place, at least so far, particularly within the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly. That session is coming to an end. So if that is what the situation is, that now the states, including India and others, probably may have to take a note of these developments as to the possible continuation of Taliban regime for longer period of time in the near future, at least in near future. A state has to take a clear position whether the recognition is necessary, or formally extending, maintaining diplomatic relations or starting diplomatic relations is necessary or not, for each probably states and decide that. And the other important question with regard to recognition is, it is predominantly a bilateral one, unless the institutions like UN grant something. And very interestingly, I think the spokesperson of the United Nations said it after the formation of the current government, that UN is not the body to recognize governments, because they don't formally recognize any government for that matter, not only Afghanistan, for any other. So essentially, it is a bilateral matter for any state to have diplomatic relations with a particular state or not, which applies to the current context of Afghanistan. However, the major issue that is very much linked to the question of recognition and diplomatic relations by states is the situation seems to be turning out to be serious and grave. That is the humanitarian concerns, particularly in terms of the food supplies and the movement of people, that is refugees fleeing the country, crossing the borders into Iran and into Pakistan. So this is a humanitarian crisis that is probably, I think the Food and Agriculture Organization has already come up with a statement looking at the grave situation in Afghanistan. So for the purpose of addressing the humanitarian concerns, which is an immediate response is expected from the international community, if the states do not have formal diplomatic relations, it might become difficult for states to even engage or extend humanitarian assistance through the state machinery, because it has to pass through the state machinery. Now, in the absence of that recognition, in the absence of the diplomatic relations for states, the other option that would be left would be either through UN or to non-governmental organizations. Through these institutions, probably the humanitarian aid would reach the people who are on the ground or seriously affected. So in the absence of those recognition of the government, or bilateral relations with the government, or diplomatic relations with the government, the focus would be more on the United Nations and other organizations related to the United Nations, as well as the non-governmental or international NGOs who would be in the forefront. I think the whole aid has to pass through them. So therefore, that would be a major challenge for any state to pass to extend any kind of humanitarian aid to the people on the ground. So the major concern probably now would be to address these humanitarian considerations, while of course politically looking at the Taliban regime and larger political issues involved, that is the status of women, the inclusive government. So it seems that I think two issues probably would be more important for any state to look at whether to extend bilateral relations or not. Seems to be one is an effective control part of it, but some states are specifically emphasizing the inclusive government. That is that purely it is not the Taliban government, but a government consisting of other representatives, other entities, political entities within Afghanistan, with an equal participation for women. At least so far, that does not seem to be happening. So far as the Taliban regime is concerned, that inclusive government has not taken place. I think women are not part of the decision-making process, neither part of the government, and also reports showing how they are, in a certain respects, are undoing certain things which were done by the previous government. So these are some of the concerns which might be factors for deciding whether to extend a formal recognition or not. The related question in relation is the recognition within the United Nations system. As I said, this is the second aspect that I would like to briefly reflect on, is the recognition at the international level, particularly the United Nations, because that is the forum where almost all the states are taking part in the deliberations of the United Nations General Assembly. Of course, the Security Council passing resolution, adopting resolutions, which it did in the past. Is that what is the position of the United Nations so far as Taliban government is concerned? It looks like prior to the General Assembly started this year, the previous representative of the previous government was claiming as the representative of the legitimate or legal representative of Afghanistan in the United Nations. So people expected that the previous government's representative might be speaking on behalf of Afghanistan state. Meanwhile, the Taliban government also claimed that they would be representing Afghanistan, and their representative should be.
Sir, please unmute.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Sorry, I think by mistake it happened. Yeah. So yes. So for both the government, that the previous government and the representative of the Taliban claimed legal position so far as representing Afghanistan is concerned. For whatever the reasons, I think none of them have spoken on behalf of Afghanistan. So it is a kind of an understanding, probably must have been from the UN's Credentials Committee, which made both of them to convince that not to speak. And neither the previous representative nor the current representative would speak, and that is what seems to have happened in the UN. So far as the United Nations as an international organization has not given any specific recognition to the current regime. The other important aspect in relation to recognition and the United Nations is that this is also linked to the recognition by other states, is that since the interim government has been formed by the current dispensation, Taliban, interestingly, I think the number people say is 14 of the ministers who are part of the government, ministers and others, are on the list, on the sanctions list of the UN Security Council. Generally, that is being referred to as a terrorist list, and that the UN terrorist list or UN prohibited them. So actually, it is not strictly a United Nations terrorist list, but it is a sanctions committee list prepared because there is a specific committee which is constituted under the United Nations mandate. There are several committees, including for Syria and others. So this is the Taliban committee specifically for Afghanistan. So some of the individuals are listed as part of that list on whom there are imposition of ban so far as they travel and their assets are concerned. So they are frozen across the world. So in other words, it is generally referred to as a terrorist list. So it is a list by the Sanctions Committee of the United Nations. Now the question arises for any country is that even for the United Nations tomorrow, if it has to allow the representative of Afghanistan to speak on behalf of Afghanistan, representative of Taliban to speak on behalf of Afghanistan, what position the UN has to take so far as that list is concerned. Probably the Security Council Sanctions Committee has to look into this to remove these names from it. At least it's not only the question of the legal contradiction within the United Nations, but it's also a question of political and legitimacy question, where there are certain individuals who are listed on the Sanctions Committee, but they are the ones who are officially representing a government in the United Nations. Now that is also going to be a challenge for other countries to recognize it, because these are the people on whom travel ban is imposed, their assets are frozen, and no state was expected to engage in any form with them as long as they are on the list. But today, suddenly, if the state extends recognition, probably they have to extend diplomatic relations because they are representing the state when the list is being maintained by the UN Security Council. So therefore, I think there is a need for the Sanctions Committee to look into this matter and to deal with the question of how to remove these names from the Sanctions Committee list. Those individuals, at least, who are on the list, who are holding the power in the current government, their names probably needs to be removed. It is not the question of arguing for or against removal of their names. It is only a question of the legal impediments for the question of for extending recognition. This is a legal impediment which in fact is a problem for United Nations in general tomorrow, not only in the case of Afghanistan, for any other matter. So therefore it becomes the question of that, how can you continue to engage within those same individuals whom you listed as part of the Sanctions Committee. So therefore that is going to be a challenge for the UN. Probably that is one of the reasons why it would have suggested the Taliban, the current government, not to insist on they being represented at the UN General Assembly. But that needs to be addressed, if not this year, by next year, or if not this year, if not for this session, for any near future session of the UN Security Council. At least they need to take up this matter in some form or the other. So therefore, the recognition by states and recognition by other intergovernmental bodies is very much also linked to the question of the status of those individuals who are listed in the Sanctions Committee and who are equally on the list of the government representatives, ministers, and other holding other positions in the Afghan current government. So that is one issue with regard to the recognition and the United Nations system. The third aspect that is equally crucial, actually, that is probably one has to look at it more carefully, is that US-Taliban agreement. This agreement was signed by both the representatives of the United States as well as the representatives of Taliban. Both of them signed this agreement on 29 February 2020. There are some interesting factors in relation to this agreement, which are legal as well as politically important aspects that one should take note of before making any analysis or observations on what constitutes what should be the relation of various states and IOs to Afghanistan. This agreement was entered into by Taliban and the US in 2020. The first aspect that should draw our attention, attract our attention, is that this is an agreement between US as a state and the Taliban as a non-governmental organizer or a non-state actor. We can broadly put it as NSA, non-state actor. And if you look at the title of the agreement, very interestingly, and the entire text of the agreement, which is of course available on the website and the net, it's a 4-page agreement. And if you look at the title of this agreement, it very clearly says that the US is not extending any kind of recognition to Taliban. You say the name of the agreement is that Agreement for Bringing Peace to Afghanistan between the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which is not recognized by the United States as a state and is known as the Taliban and the United States of America. So if you look at the agreement, everywhere when they refer to Taliban, they mention the entire name, that is Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which is not recognized by the United States as a state and is known as the Taliban. That was in 2020 February. So it is an agreement entered into between the US and the Taliban as a non-state actor then. Very interestingly, this whole agreement is about establishing peace in Afghanistan. The title is Agreement for Bringing Peace in Afghanistan. An agreement is being entered into by an external state to bring peace in a particular state where you're not entering into an agreement with the government there. You're entering into an agreement with a non-state actor to bring peace in Afghanistan. I'm not saying that it never happened before. There are instances where states and non-state actors enter into agreements, wherever especially those non-international armed conflicts, what we call in international humanitarian law, you come across agreements where states entering into agreements with non-state actors, what you call as a peace agreements, ceasefire agreements, they do happen. It's not the first time that it is happening. But mostly it happens between the state, which is holding the power, the government, which is holding the power, and the non-state actor. Or it could be that it is the government which is holding the power, is the non-state actor, plus other states or regional organizations. But here in this agreement, the government that was in power then in 2020 was completely excluded from this agreement, when the whole agreement was essentially to bring peace to Afghanistan. So, but this agreement, strangely, between the US, which is technically speaking, a different state. It is a different state. It is not Afghanistan, at least. And the non-state actor operating in Afghanistan, but without any say or any role for the Afghanistan government then. Now, that is one, I think, which should trouble all of us, or those who keenly observe international relations and international law. How does it happen that without any involvement of the existing government, a state, an external state, could enter into an agreement with the non-state actors to bring changes in the government? And almost those changes, if you carefully read this agreement, of course, nowhere the agreement says that the future government in Taliban is going to hold the future government. Now, that does not say that. The agreement does not say that. But it more or less says in different ways. It talks about establishing the future Islamic government. Now, when it says that it talks about future Islamic government, it is more or less very clear that what is going to be the shape of the future government. So it is not that something that Taliban came in and it started imposing restrictions on women and imposing Sharia law or Islamic, whatever they think as the fundamentals of Islam, imposing on people. Yes, whether it's not happening just because Taliban has come to power. It is almost set that in 2020 itself, the government very clearly, the agreement very clearly mentioned that the future Islamic government, it refers to somewhere in the agreement that the future Islamic government. So in other words, it is very clear for those who, at least for the US, it was very clear that in the agreement it is mentioned that the future government is more or less going to own these models. So, which is very clearly mentioned there. The agreement does not very say that. And if you look at the agreement, the first part of it, it says a comprehensive peace agreement is made of 4 parts. So one is guarantees and enforcement mechanisms that will prevent the use of soil of Afghanistan by any group or individual against the security of the US and its allies. So US and its allies were more concerned about their security and entering into an agreement with Taliban, not with Afghan government. The second requirement, again, it says that guarantees and enforcement mechanisms and announcement of a timeline for the withdrawal of all foreign forces from Afghanistan. Of course, that is over now. So if you look at this agreement, primarily, I think US was entering into an agreement with Taliban that tomorrow nothing should happen, or nothing should happen from Afghanistan against the United States or its own interests. Now, it could be not just Taliban, but other entities, what it call now, they call it as ISS or or Al-Qaeda. So they were basically taking assurance from Afghanistan, from Taliban, interestingly. Probably it was with an understanding that they are going to be playing a major role in the future government, though currently that it is a completely Taliban which holds the power. So it was this agreement, if one looks at carefully, it has many contradictions in it. But it also, if you look at it, it is a more or less, it was set that the Taliban is going to be in government in some form or the other in future government. The only difference probably was that the withdrawal had happened very quickly, and very quickly the capture of power by Taliban had taken place. Probably one can say that they would not have expected that so quickly Taliban could take control of the entire governance the way it is happening now. That was the only consideration. Otherwise, the agreement in almost had foreseen that they are going to be part of the government and they are going to impose what they think as the model of governance. So then the question arises is that whether today what is happening for the students of international law, this becomes important, is that whether US can be held accountable from the legal point of view, if one has to look at it, for entering into an agreement with a non-state actor, which in fact is leading to certain violations under international law. Like if everybody is arguing that women restrictions are being imposed on women, it is a clear violation of Afghanistan's international law obligations with regard to International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and other human rights treaties, as well as, in fact, I think the previous constitution of Afghanistan says that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has become part of its domestic law. So it would amount to violation of all these human rights obligations. When from international law point of view, those who are students of international law would understand the state responsibility point of view, whether the US can be held accountable for what it had done through by way of entering into an agreement and by way of facilitating the violation of international law in some other state. Because legally almost US has paved the way for that thing. So this is one question which in fact should trouble anyone who is concerned with the role of non-state actors in any situation, or the role of the relevant government in any particular conflict or a post-conflict or a transition, societies in transition. So that is where I think one has to look at it, what role United States has already played. It's not only mere withdrawal, but it also set the stage for what the next governance is going to be. So one has to reflect on how the accountability or state responsibility framework should work vis-a-vis US, particularly in relation to this agreement, that one has to really reflect on. At least going by the legal position, yes, there has to be some form of an accountability that has to happen. Okay, that is the third point that I wanted to reflect on. The fourth issue is the fourth and the last aspect that I would be reflecting is the International Criminal Code, that is to do with more of international law students and those who are concerned with human rights and humanitarian law. So the matter relating to the violations that have taken place in Afghanistan is a matter which is being investigated or which is pending, or in certain respects pending, before the International Criminal Court. So recently what had happened after Taliban took over power in Afghanistan, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court requested the trial chamber of the International Criminal Court seeking permission to investigate the violations of international law, human rights and humanitarian law, which fall under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. So why prosecutor has asked now? So it's a long history. Of course, it is almost like a decade-old history. Afghanistan became a party to the statute of the ICC in 2003, and after that, the investigation was sought to be conducted by the prosecution. The court refused to grant permission to the prosecutor. It went up to the level of appeal. So I'm not going into the details, the legal details of the different stages and different litigation and or different stages of the litigation of Afghanistan ICC. But more importantly, in 2020, the International Criminal Court permitted the prosecutor to go ahead with investigating the crimes that took place in Afghanistan. And many who followed would know that US suspected that the prosecutor's office would be conducting investigation which would involve the violations committed by the US forces as well. So therefore, the US government, the previous government, the Trump regime, imposed sanctions on the previous prosecutor, Bensouda, and other staff members, so that they don't enter into United States. So, and there were many statements which were given against the ICC staff, including the prosecutor. The current government lifted those sanctions on the ICC staff, and meanwhile, the previous prosecutor left and the new prosecutor came. The previous Afghan government requested the deferral of the matter so that they would be conducting trials at the domestic level. But since the government has changed now, the new prosecutor asked for the permission of the ICC to conduct investigations. Now, that is a whole background. But what is important is that the response of the court. What the ICC said is that when prosecutor said that since the government has changed now, the current government is uncertain whether they would be conducting trials for the violations that have taken place in Afghanistan, the prosecutor wants to go ahead with investigation. The court said that it is and with whom the ICC and the prosecutor has to engage today as a legitimate government. So there is a confusion. So interestingly, the court ordered that requested the UN Secretary General to give an opinion as to who is the legal representative of Afghan government. And the court asked the Secretary General as well as the Assembly of the Bureau of the Assembly of State Parties to respond by 8th November as to who is the legitimate representative of Afghanistan. At least going by the information that I have, it looks like either the UN Security Secretary General has not responded, or probably would have responded, but it is not made open. So far, it looks like no information as to what the United Nations Secretary General is going to respond to the International Criminal Court. So with regard to who would be representing Afghanistan before the ICC as a state, as a government. So I think the court itself has a confusion as to whose position, whose statement has to be taken, because it didn't go by what the prosecutor said. It clearly said that the court does not get into the political position of what the current assessment of the current political situation. But that is one aspect. The other aspect is that, very interestingly, when the prosecutor moved this petition this application requesting the approval of the ICC for starting the investigation, he made a statement. In fact, he issued a statement which is available on the ICC website that he is not going to conduct investigation for all the crimes that have taken place, means all the violations that have taken place in Afghanistan from 2003 onwards. And very interestingly, he said that he would be specifically focusing only on the crimes that were committed or accused of being committed by Taliban as well as the Islamic State, that is Khorasan province, ISK. So the prosecutor says that because of the paucity of the resources, because he says that he does not have much of the resources, he would be only focusing on the crimes committed by Taliban and ISIS Afghanistan. Now, is there any problem with that? Yes, there is a major problem with that. The reason why it is a major problem is that consistently, as long as the US forces were on the territory of Afghanistan, there were accusations or allegations of violations of international human rights and humanitarian law by the US forces. And strictly speaking, any situation which is under investigation, the prosecutor is expected to investigate all the matters or all the allegations or all the crimes that have taken place on the territory of a particular state, that is Afghanistan. So in other words, the prosecutor has clearly come up with a position that he is not going to look into the violations committed by United States or other allied forces violations. So he wants to only focus on Taliban and ISIS Afghanistan. Now, this is something unusual because till recently, I mean, before the new prosecutor took over, at least the previous prosecutor was emphasizing on dealing with all the crimes committed by committed on the territory of Afghanistan. So this is more to do with not just Afghanistan, but also speaks volumes about what ICC is. Like uh, there has been consistently criticism against ICC with regard to its focus purely against global South states, particularly the United African states predominantly, but a few other states which are predominantly in global South. The International Criminal Court never focused on the violations committed by the global northern states. So it is a largely a question of legitimacy for the ICC than for Afghanistan. But what is relevant for Afghanistan is that at least tomorrow, even if tomorrow ICC takes up the matter, at least it is not going to focus on all the crimes that have taken place, or violations that have taken place on the territory of violations that have taken place on the territory of Afghanistan. It will be only focusing on Taliban and ISIS Afghanistan. So that is the fourth issue.
Sir, you are on mute.
Sorry. Actually, I have not done anything, but somehow it has happened. So the last point that I would like to focus on is that generally the question that arises is that in what way states like India should engage with Taliban. Now it looks like I'm not privy to what happens at the diplomatic level internally at the informal level. We only go by what is generally reported, what is available in the media. If you look at it, probably I think what one can expect for states like India, because it has a different diplomatic interests or a regional geopolitical considerations, is that somewhere I think it needs to engage or have an independent view of how to go about with Taliban, keeping in view its interests in a larger sense of what its economic aspects, because there were reports to say that almost every part of Afghanistan had some form of economic activities undertaken by India in the form of investments and others. So therefore, it has larger economic interests. Whether one likes it, that is a different topic. Whether it's the right thing or wrong thing to do. But if you purely one has to look at it from a geopolitical consideration, somewhere I think it needs to have its own independent bilateral engagement with the current government, either informally engaging with them, probably I'm sure might be doing it, and in a formal sense of extending recognition and entering into bilateral relations. At least what we could get being part of our university, some of our students are held up, in Afghanistan now, who desperately want to come to pursue their studies. So it is not happening. So it is why I'm giving this example is that somewhere I think these are the issues which need to be at a micro level, needs to be facilitated to in terms of establishing relations with the people of Afghanistan, because that is primarily going to be the primary victims of this entire exercise or entire political situation is the people of Afghanistan. Somewhere I think the attention has to be diverted towards the people of Afghanistan in terms of humanitarian considerations, in terms of their education, because large number of students are, they're not able to leave the country and pursue their studies, and the refugee crisis. People are fleeing. And one aspect which one should keep in mind is that most of the times when the refugee issue comes, whenever the refugee crisis takes place, or whenever the asylum seekers reach the European borders, there is a lot of discussion happens in and around the question of refugees. That is how we have seen when the conflict was when Taliban took over after 15th August, where large number of people were rushing to the airport to catch some flight or the other. But there are a large number of people who are not even going to the airport, but going to the nearest borders. And most of the times it is the closest states which are the host large number of refugees, and in this case it is Iran and Pakistan. So it is a refugee situation, a serious situation so far as asylum seekers are concerned, which these are the issues which need to be given adequate attention along with engaging with Taliban as a government, because it is almost like large number of people are moving, which is unaccounted, which really we do not know, get the accurate number of how many people are leaving Afghanistan and entering into the bordering territories for seeking asylum. So I think that somewhere, I think the hosting of refugees in different parts of the world, including South Asia, these are the issues which need to be reflected, along with really looking at Afghanistan and engaging with government as such. So I'll stop there, and yes, during maybe question answer session, we can come back if there are any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for enlightening us with your excellent talk on topic international law implication of recent development in Afghanistan. And thank you for letting us know the important difference between state recognition and government recognition in international law. Sir has also highlighted the various humanitarian crises which have occurred in recently in Afghanistan. For example, refugee crisis, human rights crisis, women rights issues related crisis, and also what are the political challenges UN is facing in terms of allowing formally the member of in present Taliban government who are also in UN sanction list. Sir also highlighted and spoke about the salient feature of agreement which is entered between USA and Taliban, which is of course non-state actor on 29 February 2020. And also what is the state responsibility in this context under international law. Sir, I once again thank you for this very enlightening lecture, and I'm really immensely benefited, and I'm sure who have joined this platform, they have also must have benefited. And I also would like to inform the participant, if they have any query, they can type in the chat box. I will pick up all those query in a question and answer session. So once again, thank you, sir. With this, I hand over this platform to Dr. Nagarwal, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, sir, for such a wonderful and excellent presentation on international implication of whether we should grant recognition to new Taliban regime in Afghanistan, and what are the international legal challenges and issues which are being faced by the UN and the American and other South Asian countries. Thank you very much, sir. We will definitely we will discuss more on that issue in the Q&A session after the concluding of the all three speakers' presentation. Now, I will feel proud to announce our next speaker, Dr. Gilbert Sebastian. He is one of the leading voice in the international political economy and area study, and he has done extensive work on the Kashmir also. So I wish to invite Dr. Gilbert Sebastian for his presentation. His topic is the Kashmir crisis and India's national interest, the case for a political solution. So Dr. Gilbert Sebastian, this is your presentation. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Narendra. I hope you can hear me.
Hello? Yes, sir, you are audible.
You are audible, sir. You are audible.
Okay. So as Dr. Narendra was saying, my topic is the Kashmir crisis and India's national interest, the case for a political solution. So we were trying to explore the military solution, and it is not really very successful in the sense that there are a lot of human rights violations, as it is apparent. And then we explored the legal solution, that is the removal of Article 370 and the removal of Article 35A. And then we find that still the militancy is continuing, and the mass protests are continuing, and the crisis is probably deepening. So that is why I would like to put forward this view that we need to go for a political solution in order to have a proper solution. Okay, in case I become mute, then please alert me, okay, because the network is a little problematic here. There is a scholar called J.D. Bernal. He has written a book called Science and History in 3 volumes. And the advice he gives to social scientists is that social scientists should engage with the central issues of our times, not peripheral issues. So, in fact, this is one of the central issues of our times, a burning issue, a very important conflict, and it is very important to deal with it. And we have had 3 wars around the Kashmir issue. One was in 1947-48, soon after the independence and the partition. And the other one was in 1965 during the time of the Prime Ministership of Lal Bahadur Shastri. And the third one was the Kargil War in 1999. And the tensions are ongoing. And both the states, Pakistan and India, both are nuclear armed from 1998. And there is a lot of violation of human rights also in Kashmir since 1988, particularly after the militancy began. Under the leadership of Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front, in 1988, the militancy began in Kashmir. So, Jammu and Kashmir. So, now, you know about what Burra Srinivas was speaking about Afghanistan and the rise of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan has actually created a new strategic situation for Kashmir and also for India at large. So on August 31st, 2021, there has been a congratulatory message sent by the Taliban, sent to the Taliban by Al-Qaeda. So Al-Qaeda had said, "O Allah, liberate the Levant, Somalia, Yemen, Kashmir, and the rest of the Islamic lands from the clutches of the enemies of Islam." Okay, that was the message which was sent in the congratulatory message to Taliban. Okay, and then there was also other kinds of messages that with the coming of Article 35A, repealing of Article 35A, there is possibility of a change in the demographic composition of Jammu and Kashmir, which will particularly affect Jammu, because in Kashmir the militancy is very strong, and therefore the demographic composition cannot change so easily. But in Jammu, there may be possibility of a change in the demographic composition. So then the militants had actually said that the non-residents in Jammu and Kashmir, they become legitimate targets. Okay, that was an intercepted message by one of the prominent militants in Jammu and Kashmir. So after the repeal of Article 35A. Okay, so we have been following a policy of pragmatism vis-a-vis Kashmir, as far as I understand. And pragmatism is an ideology which believes that we should be practical doers. Okay, it focuses on the short-term gains, and it is myopic in its view about the long-term consequences, and therefore the means adopted are inconsistent with each other. You may adopt one means today, you may adopt an entirely different means tomorrow. So it is quite an opportunistic kind of tactics or strategy, which is adopted by the pragmatic kind of method. And the Americans are very fond of pragmatism. They believe in being practical doers. And the ethical concerns take a backseat when you go with pragmatism. So that is why in philosophy, pragmatism is not very well considered. Actually, in the field of education, it was a person called John Dewey who is the proponent of pragmatism. But then when you apply it to international relations and politics, then there is a problem. Okay, so actually the realists, they believe in statism. Realism, as you might know, is the trend in is the theoretical school in international politics, which believes that states are the most important actors in international politics. So they believe in statism, and they believe in state security. State security is the most important thing. And then they believe in balance of power. Okay, as against collective security, which is advocated by liberals. Okay, so there are so every state has to rely on itself. They have to go by self-help. Okay, no other state will come to their aid. So every state has to fend for itself. That is the kind of perspective that they have. So the realists often went with the pragmatic approach. Okay, so they believed in balance of power between the different powers. And two prominent classical writers on realism are, one is E.H. Carr, who is also a historian, and the other is Hans J. Morgenthau, who has written his book called Politics Among Nations. Okay, so they basically wanted to speak about how the states behave in international politics. So that is what they wanted to analyze. But then some people, some statesmen, and some politicians, and some theoreticians, they make a fallacy confusing is and ought. That realism means that we ought to behave in a nasty manner in international politics. We should always prepare for war. Okay, so for example, Henry Kissinger, the national security advisor of President Nixon during the Vietnam War period and so on, he was a person who was a realist, who was a pragmatist, and he did not follow the ethical concerns. Okay, but these theoreticians, Morgenthau or E.H. Carr, Morgenthau, actually they spoke about enlightened national interest. Okay, so actually Morgenthau opposed the Vietnam War. And similarly, there is a newer school of realism called structural realism, or neo-realism as it is called. And the theoretician's name is Kenneth Waltz. So Kenneth Waltz also was an opponent of both the Vietnam War and also the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. Okay, so this means that actually they were the realists, these prominent realist thinkers were trying to analyze how the states behave in international politics. And they were not hawkish pragmatists in that sense. They were not trying to draw an ethical outcome out of their analysis, saying that the states ought to behave like this. That is what I understand, okay, from their understanding, from their perspective. So, but then, see, when you apply realism to real politics, then the consequences are often very problematic. Say, for example, during the Soviet occupation during 1980s in Afghanistan, the United States and its intelligence agency, CIA, tried to prop up Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda and the Islamist militant groups in Afghanistan. But then eventually the genie went out of their control and they turned against them, turned against the United States itself. So that shows the failure of their pragmatist policy. Similarly, during the presidency of President Barack Obama, and the Secretary of State was Hillary Clinton, so they started funding and arming the Islamist militants in Syria against President Bashar al-Assad, and that led to the creation of ISIS. In the case of India, we can similarly see the failure of pragmatist policy. In the case of Indira Gandhi trying to arm Bhindranwale in Khalistan, and then eventually she herself became a victim of the Khalistani movement. And similarly, Indira Gandhi supported LTT in the misadventure in Sri Lanka, and it led to the killing of her son Rajiv Gandhi, who was the prime minister in the later period. Okay, so these show that the pragmatist policy is not really a very desirable policy. I'm just giving you some examples. And then, Frantz Fanon is the person who has written the book called The Wretched of the Earth, 1961, the Algerian nationalist. And The Wretched of the Earth is a classic decolonization manifesto. So I quote him: 2 centuries ago, a former European colony decided to catch up with Europe. It succeeded so well that the United States of America became a monster in which the taints, the sickness, and the inhumanity of Europe have grown to appalling dimensions, unquote. So this shows the problem with the pragmatist policy. Okay, with this now, with this background, which you can say a conceptual background, now I turn to a brief history of Jammu and Kashmir, and I would like to underline that the pragmatist policy which we have been following in Jammu and Kashmir has not been really very successful. Okay, and we need to adopt a different kind of policy regime. Okay, so Kashmir was in the 9th century a largely Buddhist and Hindu region. Around 14th century, it became Muslim. It became Muslim majority, and it was under the control of Afghan forces during 1819 to 1846. And in 1846, Maharaja Ranjit Singh captured before 1846. It was under Ranjit Singh. Before that, it was Afghan forces, Durrani regime. That's what I remember. And in 1846, East India Company captured Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir, from Maharaja Ranjit Singh and sold it to the Dogra king Raja Gulab Singh for 75 lakh Nanak Shahi rupees, the currency of the Sikh regime during that time. Okay, so that way it was actually the Jammu and Kashmir was not part of the British Empire, the Indian British Empire. Okay, and now you can see that it was still ruled by a Dogra king, Raja Hari Singh, when the partition took place, the partition between India and Pakistan. And Jammu and Kashmir decided not to join, not to go with the policy of the communal policy of the communal policy of India for Hindus and Pakistan for Muslims, because Kashmiriyat, the Kashmiri identity, was the predominant identity among the Muslim majority people and the Pandits in Jammu and Kashmir. So it was a Hindu ruler, Raja Hari Singh, ruling over a Muslim majority population, Hindu Dogra ruler, and Sheikh Abdullah was the popular leader during that time, who represented the popular aspirations of the people there, and because he was fighting against the Dogra landlords, and the Muslims were the tenants mostly, and he represented the aspirations of the Muslim masses particularly. And both Sheikh Abdullah and Raja Hari Singh, the Hindu ruler, they supported India. They did not go with Pakistan. The mood was in favor of India. And they requested the help of India when in 1947, the Pashtun and some other tribal groups were instigated by Pakistan to attack Kashmir. And in Baramulla, they had committed a lot of atrocities, rapes and murders and all that. Very untold atrocities were committed by the Pakistani forces. Okay, and the kind of idea of India which Jawaharlal Nehru had of unity in diversity, which he sets out in his 1946 book, The Discovery of India as a secular democratic republic, which can accommodate different peoples and cultures within its ambit. So that was actually more appealing to the Kashmiris than the idea of joining a Muslim state of Pakistan. Okay, so after the war in 1948, there was a resolution of the Security Council of the United Nations, that is Resolution 47. So the resolution says that the government of Pakistan should withdraw from Jammu and Kashmir, their tribesmen and Pakistani nationals who are not normally resident there. They should withdraw from Pakistan and also from Jammu and Kashmir, and then the government of India was given the charge to conduct a plebiscite in Jammu and Kashmir. Okay, and then again, this was actually not implemented, although Nehru was the friend of Sheikh Abdullah. In 1953, Sheikh Abdullah was arrested, and more than a decade he was in jail because he supported independence demand, Azadi demand. So he was in jail. And actually, since Jammu and Kashmir was not part of India, it was actually able to conduct radical land reforms under the leadership of Sheikh Abdullah and later on Farooq Abdullah and so on. The process went on till 1985, and they transferred 3,02,301 acres of land to 11,23,000 beneficiaries. Okay, so that is what the study by Tara Singh Rekhi says, 1993 study. So and after the influx of the refugees from Pakistan, there was also, we should also remember that in 1940s, 48 and so on, and after partition, there was also a massacre of Jammu Muslims, and then in reaction to that, there was also killing of Hindus in some other parts of India. So these kind of things have also taken place in Jammu because after the influx of refugees from Pakistan, their communal sentiments actually influenced the people of Jammu. So then we know that the 1965 war was there. Then 1971 war was there. After the Shimla agreement was concluded, in which India was actually in a position of strength, and we agreed, India and Pakistan, Bhutto and Indira Gandhi agreed in Shimla that the disagreements will be bilaterally negotiated and a third party will not be brought in. Okay, and then in 1971, 17 December 1971, whatever line of control was there, that was actually accepted as the formal line of control. That was agreed upon. And in 1984, there was this Maqbul Butt, who was a leader of Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front, JKLF, who was killed on certain charges in the Tihar jail, and his body was actually not taken out of Tihar jail. It was buried there itself. And in 1987, the assembly in the assembly elections, the pro-Azadi groups, Muslim United Front, led by Jamaat-e-Islami, and also People's Conference, led by Abdul Ghani Lon, all these people, they actually were supposed to win the election. But it is alleged that this election was completely rigged. And then soon after that, the militancy began. But the militancy began not only because the elections were rigged, but also because the milieu had changed. The withdrawal of Soviet forces from Afghanistan had already taken place, which was a morale booster to the Islamist militants in Pakistan, and also they were ready to support the militants in Jammu and Kashmir, and therefore the militancy began in 1988 under the leadership of Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front. And Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front, JKLF, wanted to establish a secular democratic republic of Jammu, Kashmir, Gilgit and Ladakh. Okay. So Gilgit is, as you know, the part of Kashmir, which is held by Pakistan. And then we know that, in 1990, Indian Parliament declared that J&K will be an integral part of India. In 1990s, the militancy was very strong in Kashmir. So initially, it was a primarily urban movement, concentrated mainly in Srinagar. It was an urban movement. But then after that, after the repression on JKLF, and JKLF was almost crushed by the Indian forces, then the Hizbul Mujahideen was propped up with the help of Pakistan. But then eventually Hizbul Mujahideen became pro-independence, pro-Azadi. So then Pakistan started promoting some other groups. But even now, Hizbul Mujahideen is there in Kashmir. And in early 90s, there was also 𝐒𝐞𝐿s, that is counterinsurgents, propped up by, supported by Indian forces. And Kuka Pare was one of the notorious leaders of the 𝐒𝐞𝐿s. They committed a lot of atrocities on people who were supporters of Azadi and pro-Pakistan elements. Okay, in 1999, I had the opportunity to visit Jammu and Kashmir Valley in a human rights team. And I was still a student of JNU, PhD student of JNU during that time. And the two main demands of the common people during that time was, as they used to say in Urdu, haq khud iradiyat, that means self-determination. Okay, and they wanted the kind of ideology which JKLF was promoting. One second. Seminar. Sorry. So that is Secular Democratic Republic of Jammu, Kashmir, Gilgit and Ladakh. So that was the kind of ideology which they had. Most of the people, they were speaking like that. And they did not have a problem in speaking out like that because, JKLF was no longer a militant force there. So it was basically an ideology. And then the second thing which they wanted to say, invariably everyone in all the villages, they wanted to say that we are not against any QAM, that is, any group of people. We will readily welcome the Pandits back to the valley. So this was, said by all the people, even if you don't ask, they used to readily say this. So these were the two things which we found in 1999. That was during the assembly by-elections in 1999. Okay, and then, in 2001, there was an attack on parliament. And then during 1999 to 2004, there was A.B. Vajpayee as the prime minister, during which time there were some confidence building measures which were initiated and which actually bore fruit. And we can see that by 2006, the militancy thrived. Okay, so during 1990s, militancy was very high. It was till 2005, it was in 4-digit figures. So I can show you the. Sorry, I think there is no time. I don't need to show you. From 2006, it was in 3-digit figures. The number of killings on both sides was in 3-digit figures. And by the way, there is also another political economy dimension to the Jammu and Kashmir issue. That in 1960, India had concluded a Indus Waters Treaty with Pakistan, in which 80% of the water from the Indus River was supposed to be given to Pakistan, and the hydroelectricity which is produced upstream will be taken by India. Okay, but recently, after the Uri attack, the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, he said no water for the bloodletters. Okay, so water and blood cannot flow together. So that is a kind of statement which he made. But then I think nothing has been done so far. But then this is a threat which is there on Pakistan, because Pakistan is heavily dependent on the waters from the Indus for their agriculture. Okay, and we know that according to unofficial estimates, around 80,000 people were killed and around 8,000 people disappeared in Kashmir, particularly in the Kashmir Valley during the period of militancy from 1988 to the present. So this may be also an underestimation. According to the statistics of the Ministry of Home Affairs, it is 44,729 deaths during the period of militancy till today. And out of which nearly 15,000 were civilians who were killed, 6,400 were security personnel, and 23,400 were the militants, according to the Ministry of Home Affairs, the statistics, which is available in South Asia Terrorism Portal. Okay, SAPT. Okay, and then we know that. The number of attacks on the Hindu and Sikh minority communities have actually increased after Article 370 and Article 35A were withdrawn. So, for example, this year itself, till October 8, 26 people were killed. The political workers, as well as people from minority communities in Jammu and Kashmir. Okay, so, and we have around 60 to 70,000 troops, military deployed in Jammu and Kashmir, and the total population of Kashmir Valley is 60 lakh people, that is 6 million people, which is in a small area of 15,520 square kilometers. And so that means that for every 100 persons, there is one military person in the valley. And besides, there are also police forces and the CRPF and all these kind of forces are also there. So it is by far the most militarized zone on the earth. Okay, that is the Kashmir Valley, not Jammu, the Kashmir Valley. Okay. So in 2008, November 26, we know that Mumbai terror attack took place. 26 foreign nationals and nearly 200 people in total died, and out of which 26 people were foreign nationals. So this is I think all these are actually results of the low intensity warfare, which, as they call it in the military terminology, which is going on in Kashmir. So the main cause of alienation between India and Pakistan, and also the main cause of alienation for the Muslims of Pakistan and elsewhere with India is apparently the Kashmir issue. And we know that on 14 February 2019, there was this Pulwama attack in which 41 military personnel were killed, and the suicide bomber was Adil Ahmad Dar, a 19-year-old boy. He was with the Jaish-e-Mohammed. So Jaish-e-Mohammed was founded in 2000 by Masood Azhar, who was released from the Indian jail earlier. I think Jaswant Singh, when he was the foreign minister, he had accompanied him to Kabul. So that was in 90s, late 90s. And so Jaish-e-Mohammed was founded by him. And after that, the discourse of militancy actually changed. That is, there is more attack on the minorities, and also it is more pro-Pakistan kind of discourse. And there were also other outfits like Lashkar-e-Taiba, and Harkatul Ansar. So these are also Pakistani supported groups, which are apparently Pakistani supported groups, which are also following the pro-Pakistan kind of militancy in Jammu and Kashmir. Okay, now since you are all students of law, I should tell something about Article 370, although it will be rudimentary. So Article 370 in the Indian Constitution, it was called as temporary provisions with respect to Jammu and Kashmir. Okay, so the Parliament's lawmaking powers are limited, except so in the union list and in the concurrent list, they can do the lawmaking in consultation with the government of the state. Okay, and then this was the kind of law that was there, and then the concurrence of the state, government of the state was required. Government of the state and the constituent assembly was required for repealing this provision. Okay, this I think basically so they had a prime minister, they had a separate flag and so on. Okay, so basically this is part of the kind of asymmetric federalism which the Indian Constitution visualized. Okay, so it visualized different provisions for different regions. Like we have the 6th schedule for the tribal states of the Northeast India, and there are Article 371 which are applicable to some of these tribal states in Northeast India, like Nagaland and Mizoram and so on. Okay, so like that, this was also one of the provisions which is part of the feature of asymmetric federalism in the Indian Constitution. Okay, and that's what I can say. And then there was Article 35A, which was also repealed on 5 August 2019. And this was the right to permanent residence of Jammu and Kashmir. That is right to employment under state government, acquisition of immovable property in the state, and settlement in the state, and right to get scholarships and other forms of aid from the state government. So these were actually Article 35A. So after the repeal of Article 35A in 2019, August 5, actually, I was talking to a Kashmiri person, so he was saying that, in fact, this may affect Jammu, but this will not affect Kashmir, given the state of militancy there now, because nobody will dare to go and buy land there and so on. Okay, so I would like to draw a difference between mainland and frontiers in India, in the political economy of India. There is a geopolitical distinction between the mainland and the frontier. So in the frontiers, the citizens do not enjoy complete citizenship rights de facto. Actually, they do not enjoy complete citizenship rights. So, and then there are ethnic and religious differences which mark them out from the mainland. For example, the caste system is not very prominent in Jammu and Kashmir or in the tribal states of Northeast India. Okay, and they are very proud about that. And then so these are actually politically constructed, geopolitically constructed categories, and there are instances of discrimination against religious minorities, Dalits, Adivasis, migrant workers, and so on, in the mainland India also. But then that is not of a geopolitical nature. This is of a geopolitical nature. Okay, this geopolitical category of frontiers is a dynamic category. It can change. For example, Mizoram. There is no militancy in Mizoram after 1985. Earlier, Indira Gandhi's time, they had used even helicopter gunships in 1979 against the Mizo rebels. So that is not the case now. So it can change actually, and even some parts of the mainland India had militant movements, secessionist movements, for example, in Tamil Nadu or Punjab or the Punjab, and then they eventually they continued as part of the mainland. So this is a dynamic category, but then definitely there is a distinction between the mainland and the frontiers. So in 2009-10, there was a discussion about deploying army in the Maoist areas in the mainland India, Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand and so on. And then both the chief of army staff and the chief of air staff, they oppose this, saying that they are our own citizens. But then, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act is operational in the tribal states of Northeast India, in several of the tribal states of Northeast India, since 1958. Okay, and it was extended to Jammu and Kashmir in 1990. Okay, this was also applied in Jammu and Kashmir in 1990. So what is this Armed Forces Special Powers Act? It says that even the officers down to the level of Havildar in the armed forces will have the privilege to shoot and kill anyone in the disturbed areas, and they will not attract any punishment. Okay, and even a first information report, FIR, cannot be registered without the prior sanction of the union government. So this is an exceptional, extraordinary law which was used, but then this law was actually has continued for years and years. So there is a generalized state of exception, as Giorgio Agamben, the Italian legal theorist, says about how a generalized state of exception can be introduced to say the fundamental rights. Okay, so this can be applied in the case of Jammu and Kashmir. So the liberal democratic discourse of rule of law or nomos is largely non-functional in these vast regions, which are the frontiers or the heavily militarized zones of India. Okay, so an Indian state is selectively repressive against adversaries who violate its canons. So they may be very lenient towards the right-wing outfits, even if they commit crimes. Say, for example, in Delhi riots. But then, they will be very, very repressive towards the Islamist militants, the nationality movements, and the Maoist movement, and so on. Okay. So, so there is all these things, they actually point to the failure, the relative failure of the pragmatic policy which we were following. So we find that, even yesterday, there was an encounter in which they say civilians were killed in Kashmir Valley, and the body was not handed over. The body was not handed over means, it's a violation of Geneva Convention of the Rules of War. Okay, and that is very traumatic, isn't it? So, I think the best way of integrating all the nationalities in the world, I'm actually for integration of nationalities. I am actually for integration of India as well as the whole of South Asia as a prelude to the integration of all the nationalities in the world. But then, I think the best method of integrating the nationalities is to have not a forcible or vertical integration, but a democratic and horizontal integration. Okay, not a forcible integration. That's what I believe in. And but unfortunately, the political milieu today is that the Wilsonian Leninist principle of self-determination, as it is called, is no longer respected in most of the world today. So Wilsonian means, Woodrow Wilson and also Lenin. These two people had actually supported right to self-determination. So Lenin had his article in 1914, the right of nations to self-determination. So he was against the policy of the Russian state towards the oppressed nationalities of catch them and hold them. That is called as a prison house of nationalities. Russia was called as a prison house of nationalities. And then what does Lenin actually say? So I believe that, the best way to integrate is through a voluntary union, a democratic union, a horizontal union. And that is how the biggest nation in the world, the biggest country in the world was united. The biggest country in the world was united through applying the principle of self-determination. Okay. And that was Soviet Union. Okay. And it was written into their constitution that there can be right to self-determination, including secession. Okay, but then often it was not followed during the time of Stalin and so on. But then this principle is something very honorable. And with that principle, they were actually able to unite. So what did Lenin say about the national interest of the Russians if they continue to oppress other nations? He says that it is the suppression of these oppressed nations is an enormous obstacle to the cause of freedom of the great Russian people itself, in the form of prejudices, etc. Okay, and he says the great Russian proletariat, that is the working class, cannot achieve its own aims, or clear the road to its freedom without systematically countering these prejudices. Okay, so that was the milieu during that time in 1914, when anti-colonial movements were also going on in the world. And Article 15 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 spoke about the right to a nationality and a right to change its nationality. Okay, and Article 1 of the UDHR speaks about the principle of self-determination. And Article 1 of ICCPR, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and Article 1 of International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, they also speak about the right to self-determination. But then this is given up in most of the world. So except in situations where there has been genocidal situations, like in the case of East Timor in 1999, it was liberated from Indonesia in 1999, because 1/3 of the population was wiped out in East Timor. And also in South Sudan, there was a genocidal situation, and therefore the international community intervened and created a separate state in 2011. Okay, so but then there are also cases in Europe, for example. There was a Scottish referendum recently, I think it was in 2017, in the context of Brexit, whether they want to join with the European Union or they want to continue with the United Kingdom. Okay, so that is practiced even in liberal democratic countries. So in Scottish referendum, it was applied in 2017. And similarly, but then, unfortunately in India, liberals as well as the Marxists, CPI, CPIM and all, they have also given up on this principle. I will call it unfortunate because I believe in democratic integration of nationalities. Okay, I am for integration actually. I am not for secession or separation, but then it should be a democratic integration where you will respect the human rights of these people. We'll consider the Kashmiris also as our own people. Okay. So now to speak about coming to the situation in Jammu and Kashmir, these are children of war who are born from 1988. The people who are born there, they are children of war, it is called. They are immune to fear. So they do what you call the Kashmir Intifada, 2008-9 onwards. Okay, and then so you may find that the number of killings has come down, but then the mass protests have gone up from 2009 almost. So you can the killing of Burhan Wani in around 2016, and there was mass protests which went on till 2018, isn't it? So you know that. So but then I will caution to add that see, suppose a nationality separates itself and forms a separate state. In the context of neo-colonial exploitation, it is not a guarantee for self-determination as such, because most of the countries or nations which were liberated from colonialism during the post-Second World War period, they succumbed to indirect exploitation under neo-colonialism. So self-determination itself is not a guarantee for self-determination. Okay, so this also has to be borne in mind by people who are fighting for independence and so on. So then there is this study by Yoginder Sikand, who says how the national liberation movement in Jammu and Kashmir has eventually, in the 1990s, it was a national liberation movement, and eventually it has turned into a jihadi movement from 2000. In 2000s. Okay, so what is the kind of, now I'll come to the kind of solution which we can advocate. I think I have taken more time, so I will come to the solution. What kind of solution you can have in Jammu and Kashmir? Okay, so there is Charles Taylor, who is also a person from Quebec in Canada. Quebec is a French-speaking nationality in Canada. And Canada is, as you know, it's an English-speaking nation, and they have differences, and they feel discriminated and so on. So Charles Taylor speaks about reasonable accommodation in the context of Quebec in Canada. Okay, this is a concept which we can apply even in the case of Jammu and Kashmir. Okay, and there are other examples internationally. So you can look at the case of how the Irish conflict was resolved by the UK in the Good Friday Agreement and so on in 1998. So there was a lot of fight. Irish Republican Army was there. They used to detonate bombs and so on. But then, this clash has come to an end through consensus between the parties. So this is a kind of model. These are models which we can actually emulate. And right to life with dignity, Article 21, which is expansively defined by the Supreme Court of India, that can be actually applied in the case of the Kashmiris. Say, for example, the right to internet is designated by the Supreme Court as a fundamental right, but unfortunately, it is largely denied to the Kashmiris. So, and then you have to generate a kind of goodwill, as during the time of Prime Minister Vajpayee, there was Lahore Bus and Samjhauta Express, because you see the Kashmiris have their relatives on the other side of the border, and those who are from there, they have relatives here. So that is why you can see that from 2006, you can find that militancy had come down. We can actually make the visa regime a little more flexible. The liberal intellectuals from Pakistan and the other side of Kashmir, the Pakistan administered Kashmir, can come here. The cultural personalities, higher officials and so on, they can come here. There should be people-to-people exchange. Okay, the visa regime has to be made more lenient. But then, of course, there should be checking and all that there should be no infiltration of militants in that way. And the Kashmir houses in different states can make better opportunities for Kashmiris, because there are Kashmiri business people who are coming, selling carpets and cricket bats and so on. So they should be given better accommodation. There can be scholarships for Kashmiri scholars who want to study in India, in the rest of India. Okay, so it is a sort of policy which will say the cunning warrior in the film, the Spider-Man. There is a very famous statement: the cunning warrior attacks neither the body nor the mind, but the heart. So we need to win over the hearts and minds of the Kashmiri people. Okay, we need to treat them as our own people. Okay, as of now, we don't have that kind of a system where we treat them as our own. So Gramsci had spoken about Antonio Gramsci in Prison Notebooks, written in 1929 to 35. So he had spoken about hegemony. Hegemony is the moral and intellectual leadership exercised by an emerging class or social forces on the larger society. So hegemony has to be based more on consent and less on coercion. Okay, but you look at the case of Kashmir Valley today, there coercion is the rule, consent is an exception. Okay, so there is a limited nature of consent, which leads to a weak basis for the political order. Okay, and then we come to rely increasingly on force. Okay, so Frantz Fanon again, Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, 1961. He speaks about nationalism. I quote, a bourgeoisie that has only nationalism to feed the people fails in its mission and inevitably gets tangled up in a series of trials and tribulations. If nationalism is not explained, enriched, and deepened, if it does not quickly turn into social and political consciousness, into humanism, then it leads to a dead end. A bourgeois leadership of the underdeveloped countries confines the national consciousness to a sterile formalism. Okay, sterile formalism, that is what he says. Okay, so we can see something like that, even in India today. We get fixated with the flag, the map, and the anthem, the respect for these external trappings. Actually, what should be nationalism? Nationalism should be the love of the people. Okay, and people, because people and people alone can make or unmake a nation. Okay, so love for the people should constitute the substantive content of true nationalism. Okay, we have to go back to that nationalism which would love its people, not focus on the sterile formalism of external trappings. Okay, and then we can remove Armed Forces Special Powers Act 1990, which is applied in Jammu and Kashmir, at least from the non-border districts. As the militancy reduces, militancy is actually reduced from 2006 onwards. The number of killings have come down. So if we have a policy of reasonable accommodation, then we can actually bring down the use of AFSPA in 1990. Okay, and then we should understand that there are vested interests in the perpetuation of the conflict. For example, we are a major buyer of arms in the international market. So the sellers would like us to continue fighting with each other, and also China apparently benefits from the Indo-Pak conflict. Okay, so we should actually go for confidence building measures, and in the long term we should also try to phase out military deployment, not immediately, because immediately then that will create a chaos. Okay, and once the conducive atmosphere is created for peace, then the will of the Kashmiri people can be known, as Sanjay Kak was speaking on Al Jazeera, was saying. Okay, so we need a certain out-of-the-box thinking on Kashmir conflict, which has been brewing for 33 years from 1988 now. Okay, so in the interest of India, this is a question which I would like to pose. Can we think of the feasibility of creating J&K as a buffer state between India and Pakistan? As a buffer state. Okay, so there will be peace between India and Pakistan. But then, for that, there has to be gradual demilitarization, and then the will of the Kashmiri people has to be known. The more there is repression on the Kashmiri people, the more they will side with Pakistan, because they don't find any other support. So they will support more, they will go more with Pakistan. So, but then, gradual demilitarization, gradual building of confidence building measures. Okay, these things can actually reveal what is the will of the common people there in Jammu and Kashmir. Okay, and then this threat of jihadis from Afghanistan is looming large, and also the Taliban may be more soft on them, and India, being the regional hegemon, has to take the onus of leadership. Okay, so India should be more generous towards Pakistan and other countries in the region. and it should take the leadership to build the goodwill. Okay, so sometimes this may be interpreted as a strategic retreat, but then one step forward, two steps back.
And I'm sorry for interruption, Dr. Gilbert. Kindly conclude your presentation in next 5 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I'm just concluding. Okay, so say for example, the Soviet Union and the United States had, in their national interest, made a strategic retreat from Afghanistan. Okay, so many people interpreted it as very shameful and all that, but then there is strategic retreat. So similarly, India should take a decision on Jammu and Kashmir, how we have to manage this issue in the interest of our in the interest of our national interest. Yes. Okay. So my question is whether we have another question which I would like to pose is whether after the Hindutva turn in Indian politics, whether we have the wherewithal to include the only Muslim majority state in the country. This is a challenge which we have to face. Okay, so we don't have anymore the kind of unity in diversity kind of discourse which we have. So this is the kind of understanding which I have. But then we have to take some bold steps, and we have to be very serious about the human rights of the Kashmiri people, which will actually help the imparting of democratic consciousness to the people of the mainland India as well. Okay, as Lenin was saying, the Russian people cannot liberate themselves unless they oppose the national oppression. Okay, like that, So, and then, finally, I would like to conclude with Gandhi, the quote by Gandhi, who says, when I despair, when I despair, I remember that all through history, the way of truth and love has always won. There have been tyrants and murderers, and for a time they seem invincible, but in the end, they always fall. Think of it, always. Okay, thank you. I have references if you want references and so on, references on the Kashmir. Then I can give you references during the question and answer session. So I stop here. Thank you for giving me the opportunity, Narendra and the Faculty of Law, Delhi University. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Gilbert Sebastian, sir, for demonstrating your excellent speech on topic Kashmir crisis and India's national interest, the case for a political solution, which is, of course, is ever-burning topic. Sir spoke about the state behavior in international politics. Sir has also highlighted the realistic approach and ethical approach and its ideological clash in terms of forming the opinion. And also, sir also spoke about right to self-determination, its importance, and gave a lot of example to comprehend this idea. For example, Vietnam War, USA-Iraq invasion, Mumbai terror attack, etc. Thank you, sir, for sharing so many important references while delivering your lecture. I'm sure all these references are going to be very useful for all of us. And with this, I thank you, sir, for your excellent lecture. And now I hand over the platform to Dr. Narendra Agrawal, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yadav, and thank you again, Dr. Gilbert Sebastian. It was a wonderful presentation, no doubt that you have touched so many areas and the concern, and you have also suggested some solutions. the Irish and Scottish model of political solution of the problem. uh, Really remarkable, and I hope that our beneficiary students and the participant will definitely benefited from this deliberation and suggestions. And thank you all, and thank you once again, Gilbert. It is always pleasure to listen to you. Now I request our next speaker, Dr. Uma Purushothaman, and ma'am is also associated with the Central Institute of Kerala. She is teaching international relations in Central Institute of Kerala, Kasargod, and she's also associated with the earlier in Observer Research Foundation (ORF), which is leading think tank of the country, and her major area of interest is Russian foreign policy and power politics and the US and East Asian politics, and she has also uh, leading name in the as a editorial team of leading journals of India and abroad. So it is my privilege to announce our next speaker, Professor Dr. Uma Purushothaman. Ma'am will speak on the topic mapping India's security challenge. I think that this will be a brainstorming session, because I personally believe that the security challenges in India, we have to tackle these issues because we are facing a lot of issues, eastern sector and northern sector also. Can we handle the situation of the two front war, the combination and the China Pakistan combined forces? What are the challenges lying ahead for India in terms of foreign policy and the protection of our national interest? Thank you, ma'am. Over to you, ma'am, please.
Thank you, Dr. Narendra. Am I audible? Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, you are
ma'am,
audible.
you are audible.
Okay. So first, let me thank the Faculty of Law for inviting me for this conference. I'd like to particularly thank Dr. Narendra for bringing us all together here for this forum. And I think it's going to be a tough act to follow the two very erudite lectures by Dr. Srinivas Burra and Dr. Gilbert Sebastian. Like Dr. Narendra said, I'll be speaking on India's major security challenges. But my presentation is not really focused on Afghanistan per se, because, though I do address at some point the threat from Afghanistan. I have taken a much broader angle to this, looking at India's major security threats. So what I'll do over the next 20-30 minutes, I'll keep it short because I can already see some pre-lunch attrition. So I'll try to finish in 20-30 minutes. So what I'll try to do is try and identify these challenges and see how exactly these pose a challenge to India. So by way of introduction, since I am someone who teaches international relations, I always go back to a little bit of theory. I mean, Gilbert has already given some conceptual framework, but to go back to my reading of IR. So Barry Buzan, so when you talk about threats, Barry Buzan says that a threat, it's not necessarily about territory. It can also be about a threat to the organizational stability of a state or the system of government or the ideology which gives it legitimacy. So while I do look at the threats that Dr. Narendra talked about, I'd also be looking at how exactly these threats are not, necessarily territorial in nature. Some of these threats are political as well. I think everyone who lives in India knows that we live in a very difficult and complex environment, in a very complex neighborhood, and it's a neighborhood which is marred by a lot of legacy issues. There's a lot of leftover from the partition, for instance, and this is something which is reflected in official statements as well. With very recently you had Defense Minister Sri Rajnath Singh saying that our security challenges are becoming much more complex because of the changing geopolitical environment. I think he was mentioning this in the context of Afghanistan. So India faces threats in the conventional, subconventional insurgents, subconventional in terms of insurgency and terrorism, as well as in the nuclear domains. And India's security perspectives are governed by the interplay of our domestic imperatives, the regional balance of forces, as well as global challenges, which all have an effect on our, or impinge on our role and our capabilities. So India has this very, very long land borders of over 15,000 kilometers with 7 countries, and with many countries, these sections of our boundaries or borders are contested. Sometimes they are not even demarcated formally. Sometimes they just come up, like last year when Nepal came up with this controversy over the map. So in some areas, we do not even have a mutually agreed line of control. And sometimes our borders are open and porous, and that also creates more problems in terms of drug trafficking, human trafficking, refugees coming in, people without legal, coming in with illegally. In addition to this, of course, we also have this very long coastline of over 7,500 kilometers. And with that, we obviously have an extended maritime zone, island territories. So we have sea lines of communication for our trade and energy flows, as well as oil installations which are offshore. So maritime security is also important. So this is what I'll be looking at, the land borders, coastline, and also a little bit at human security. Now, if you look at the Fragile States Index, which was released in 2021, 3 of our neighbors rank very, very high. Afghanistan is ranked 9th, Pakistan at 29, and Myanmar at 23. So obviously being surrounded by fragile states cannot be good for the security of any country. So there is going to be a certain amount of regional instability because of that, which will impinge on our security. So to move to our primary security challenges, of course, there is an increasing realization today that our major security threat really is China. The major military threat to India comes from China. And before I go into the China challenge, I just want to go back to IR theory. When do we say that something is a threat to us, or a country is a threat to us? When we can say that only when that particular country has got capability as well as the intention to harm, or the intent to harm. And China has demonstrated that it has both the capabilities as well as the intent to harm India. So it is a threat even in the theoretical sense. Many years ago, after the nuclear test in 1998, our defense minister at that point, George Fernandez, had mentioned that China was India's reason for the nuclear test. And at that point, he was criticized by everyone for making this statement, for making this overt statement. But I think he's been very, very patient in recognizing, he seems to have been very patient in recognizing the China threat and articulating it openly so many years ago. In fact, this rivalry, in fact, has been increasing over the years. And as 𝐶𝐚𝐿 says, it has spread from the Himalayas to the subcontinent to all across the Asia, even to regions which were historically and geographically closer to India than China, like the Persian Gulf, the Middle East, the east of Africa, the Western Indian island states, Indian Ocean island states. So the relations between India and China, precisely because they are neighbors, are bound to be there is bound to be undercurrents of competition and contest, and that is inherent in the very logic of geopolitical proximity and national rivalry. And please do remember that before Chinese annexed Tibet, India and China had never really interacted with each other. And after the annexation of Tibet, you of course had the Dalai Lama fleeing to India. That is an issue for China. But if you look at the border, we share a very long border of almost 3,500 kilometers, 3,488 kilometers. And many parts of that border, from the eastern, western, and the middle sectors, are disputed. And despite over 22 rounds of talks between the special representatives, we have not been able to solve the border issues. So for many years, the border seemed peaceful, but since the late 2000s, we have started witnessing more and more incursions on the border, most recently in 2020, when lives were lost for the first time since 1975. So the issue in 2020, I think, much more than the border or the physical ingress of Chinese soldiers, I think it was more of a concerted effort by the Chinese to push their version or their vision of the line of actual control onto India. And they were trying to do this by deploying massive troops. And since 2017, of course, we are all aware how the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, has been reorganizing and reinforcing its deployments in Tibet since 2017. And China's actions along the disputed borders with India seems to be, again, another version of salami slicing, which is what it is doing in the South China Sea, basically seizing small chunks of disputed territory without provoking a robust response from India and trying to probe the limits of India's tolerance. I think it's also about a certain amount of military signaling by the Chinese, telling us that they have much better capabilities, trying to put pressure on us for border talks, and also a certain amount of response to India getting closer to the United States and to the Quad. And I think at one level, it is also a response to India building border infrastructure, strengthening its border infrastructure. But beyond the border issues, I think there are many, many more issues between the two states. One is that we both have these, how do I put this, dreams of greatness. Both our countries believe that we are destined for greatness. And obviously, when you're neighbors and you both claim that you are this great civilization, and the other also claims you're this great civilization, this creates friction. So China does not pose a threat just to India's sovereignty and territorial integrity in terms of the borders, but it is also determined to prevent India rising as a major power. Yeah. And obviously, India does not want to accept Chinese domination. So if you look at a close reading, if you do a close reading of China's long-term foreign policy goals, it is basically to become this dominant player in East Asia, then become dominant in Asia, Pan-Asian domination, and eventually to move towards global primacy. And as far as the Chinese are concerned, in their view, India has been trying to get hegemony in South Asia and in the Indian Ocean. So in their view, a hegemonic India in the region will prevent Chinese hegemony at the pan. It will cause, questions being asked about Chinese hegemony at the Pan-Asian level, which is what they aspire for. And then if India becomes a hegemon, India would become stronger in East Asia, and that would also undermine Chinese domination in East Asia. The rivalry between, or the challenge from China is not just about, boundaries or these ideas of greatness. It is also about a fight between two different models of development. One is, of course, India being a democracy, and the other being a communist regime. And this rivalry, we can see it's been playing out at several levels. India has refused to join China's ambitious Belt Road Initiative for legitimate reasons, of course, because we have sovereignty issues over 𝐶PEC. And of course, we have concerns about the kind of debts, debt transparency, etc. China has also blocked India's entry into the nuclear supplies group. It is invoking the NPT, saying it has not signed it. It has still not endorsed India's demand for a seat on the UN Security Council. And China, now as it has gained much more power, it is much more willing to assert its power in pursuance of its interests along its borders. And we're seeing that in how it is acting in South China Sea, and and how it is increasingly becoming more and more assertive in Taiwan as well as in Hong Kong. So the days of China hiding its capabilities and biding its time are, gone with the wind, so to say. Again, given the lack of a transparent political system in China, in India and as well as in the rest of the world, there is much more uncertainty about its future moves. Again, we are very concerned about how China has been using economic diplomacy in our neighborhood in a bid to decrease our influence, and in fact, Chinese investments in India's neighborhood. I'm sorry? Okay. So,
kindly continue.
Yeah, China's investments in India's neighborhood is far more than India's, and China has been meddling in. Started meddling even in the political affairs of some of our neighbors. Again, China has been selling arms to Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Myanmar. And Bangladesh is now the second largest buyer of arms from China after Pakistan. It's even been buying submarines. Of course, all of these are of concern to us. It's also been supplying arms to Myanmar, helping it construct naval and electronic facilities, modernizing its naval bases. So all of these are issues of concern for India. And there's also this competitive hunt for energy and mineral resources by China and India across the world, particularly in African countries. Again, China has been modernizing its military. It's now capable of force deployments. It has expeditionary force, which is capable of power projection in far theaters. So it's got joint theater commands like the United States, because it has had 3 decades of double-digit budgetary growth and 2 decades of double-digit spending on the military. And to come to the intent, in 2015, it released a white paper on military strategy where it declared willingness to use power. Again, of course, we also face a significant nuclear threat from Pakistan and China because of this deep connection between them in nuclear technology and missile delivery. There is also an asymmetry between India and China in terms of capabilities, which is what makes this threat much more dangerous. And in the 80s, India and China were almost equal economies. But since then, China's rise has been swift, and it has emerged as a formidable power in conventional as well as nuclear capabilities. India's growth has been much slower, and this has led to a very vast power gap between us. If you look at China's GDP, it is now 5 times India's. If you look at the Indo-China trade, it is biased in China's favor. And half of our total trade deficit is with China. If you look at nuclear warheads, China's got 350, India's got 156. China even has tactical nuclear weapons. So their defense budget in 2019 was 261 billion. Ours was just 71.1 billion. So there is this huge gap between us. As I have some statistics on military resources. I think I'll skip that because I think we're already running short of time. China also has cyber warfare capabilities. And while it is true that we stood up to the Chinese in 2020, the conventional balance on certain indexes is still very much in favor of China. And China is officially preparing for a 1.5 war scenario with contingencies involving India, on fighting with India in the Himalayas as well as in the Indian Ocean. And again, another expression of hostility in 2021 October, China adopted a new border law which tries to formalize its territorial gains along its border with India and Bhutan. Again, India officially said that it is concerned about it. So clearly, China is going to remain a major security challenge in the future. So Professor Kanti Bajpai, in his recent book, Why India and China Are Not Friends, identified 4 Ps for the reasons that India and China remain hostile. He says there are negative perceptions among the elites, differences over perimeters or borders, rival partnerships, our partnership with the United States, China's partnership with Pakistan, and the power asymmetry between the 2 countries as being the drivers of the India-China conflict. There is also a 5th P, which is what I'm going to talk about, Pakistan. So every child in India knows about the hostility between India and Pakistan, so I'm not going to get into the details of that. We have disputed borders with Pakistan as well. Pakistan remains a military threat to us. We've fought many wars with them. There have been many skirmishes on the borders with them. And this is made worse by the fact that Pakistan is also now a de facto nuclear power. And India-Pakistan relations have remained hostile over a variety of reasons, Kashmir, 𝐒𝐚𝐿, and now most recently Afghanistan. But if you look at the India-Pakistan rivalry or the hostility, it is also rooted in the legacy of partition. And it has become sharper because of their conflicting national interests and ideologies. So Pakistan's inability or incapacity to work out a viable form of nationalism and its eternal quest for achieving parity with India is actually the main reason why Pakistan is so hostile towards India. And it has been trying to change the status quo through either direct wars or through proxy wars against India. And there is also ideology at play here, secularism versus the idea of an Islamic state. And India's security challenges, like Dr. Narendra was saying, have been amplified by the relations or the alliance axis between China and Pakistan. Now, China's relationship with Pakistan is obviously also driven by a desire to make sure that India remains tied up in South Asia, to ensure that India remains a subcontinental power. So it is a very deep alliance, and you hear these stories about, higher than the Himalayas, we are these brothers and all of that. There was this 1963 agreement between China and Pakistan, where part of Kashmir, 𝐍𝐚𝐿 Valley was to the Chinese, and this enabled the Chinese to build the Karakoram highways in the 1970s. China has helped Pakistan in developing its nuclear weapon capabilities, well documented. China has concluded a $46 billion CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, with Pakistan, which will allow, which would link the Xinjiang region to the Gwadar port, the Arabian Sea, and give China access to the Indian Ocean. So the Gwadar port would serve as a deep water port for Chinese nuclear submarines as well. Also, there is a lot of increased interoperability between the militaries of the two countries in areas like mission compatibility, doctrines, force structure, operational planning. There's also interoperability in terms of military hardware. There is a lot of compatibility in equipment because Pakistan gets a lot of equipment from the Chinese. The Pakistan Air Force also fields Chinese-built jets and trains. It undertakes a number of exercises with the PLA Air Force. The navies also have similar warships, and there are also frigates which have been supplied to China, to Pakistan's navy. Pakistan also has got access to China's Baidu satellite navigation system and to secure communications in the form of fiber optic cables which run through the Karakoram highway. So the possibility of a two-front war against India cannot be ruled out. And I was reading this scenario the other day where, people say that the Chinese have military deployments in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir as part of the CPEC. And this actually complicates India's two-front challenge because, if there is a war between India and Pakistan, and if there's an Indian offensive against Pakistani targets, and if it inadvertently strikes Chinese troops or civilians in Pak-occupied Kashmir, this could trigger Chinese retaliation against India. So that makes the situation very, very dangerous. So moving on to the next threat, since Afghanistan was the focus of this seminar, of this webinar, I thought I'd just talk a little bit about Afghanistan. Of course, the volatile situation in Afghanistan is of major concern to India. We do not share borders with Afghanistan, but we have vital geopolitical stakes in what is happening there because it can impinge on our regional security interests. So any fundamentalist regime in Afghanistan would be a threat to our own ideology of secularism, and it would destabilize the region. And obviously, a Taliban regime would be antagonistic to India. India is also obviously worried about the spillover effects of the Taliban regime in terms of the impact of ideology, violence, narco-terrorism, particularly into Kashmir. So we have these groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, who have bases on the borders between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Now they'll get much more space to carry out attacks against India. So the Taliban in power would also mean that the Pakistanis get much more influence there, that they're able to influence outcomes in the country. But they have for so many years, they have looked for getting strategic depth, and this is like, a dream come true for them. Again, whenever troops pull out of Afghanistan, one sees that there is a space for pan-Islamist terrorist groups to grow, whether it is, post-Soviet withdrawal Afghanistan, or how the Al-Qaeda and the ISIS rose after the US intervention in Iraq and pull-out investigation. So we obviously worry that these ungoverned spaces could be used for running terrorist camps against us, and that it will become a haven for militants from Afghanistan. There is also this INSTC and the Chabahar port, which we have built to circumvent Pakistan, but this might become unviable. So in Afghanistan, what we see is that India's two major threats, China and Pakistan, have both deepened their footprints. That is obviously not good news for India. The next is the threat, the challenge of maritime security. Maritime transport handles around 70% of India's trade in value terms. And like I was mentioning about the South China Sea, 38% of our trade flows are through the South China Sea. So our national maritime security strategy says that 80% of our crude oil imports are from or through the sea. So we have to protect those slots. 11% of crude oil is from offshore energy resources in the Indian EEZ. Offshore gas pipelines also contribute 80% of our domestic natural production, more than 90% of international trade by volume, and 70% of value is carried over the seas. And there are several potential threats and challenges to India's locks from both traditional and non-traditional sources, which can impact our national interests. The security of these threats would require that all of them remain free, secure, and free, safe, secure, and free for movement of shipping, as prescribed by international law. So, hence the need for us to protect these locks and to prevent other countries or other powers from having the ability to block them. There's also the issue of piracy, which has come down in recent times, of course. And then safety and security of Indian citizens or the Indian diaspora in other countries is also an important consideration. There are this large number of Indian citizens who are in many of these regions which are afflicted with instabilities, and that adds to our maritime challenges. In recent years, our Navy has been deployed to evacuate people in many of these crisis-affected regions. Again, there is the issue of maritime terrorism. If you remember the Mumbai attacks, many of the explosives arrived via the sea. And then, of course, Chinese naval presence, which is increasing in the Indian Ocean, is a major military challenge to India's maritime security. And there are regular surface and subsurface naval deployments by the PLAN or the PLA's Navy in the Indian Ocean. To come to terrorism, South Asia, along with the Middle East, is becoming the epicenter of terrorism. And this terrorism, on one hand, has been abetted by Pakistan, but it has also been fueled by the growth of religious extremism in many communities. So it's not just one community that you see a rise, upsurge in religious extremism. You see that upsurge in many other communities as well, and it has it's kind of a vicious circle effect, in the sense that one community becoming more extremist leads to the other one also becoming much more aggressive, and that creates a lot of problems. So if you look at the United Kingdom's travel advisory to India, the most recent one, it says that terrorists are very likely to carry out attacks in India, and media reports suggest that the Daesh or the ISIL is looking to attack targets in India, either directly or through inspiring lone wolf attacks. So clearly there is a threat of terrorism for India, though of course, fingers crossed, we've not seen too many attacks in recent times. Gilbert was talking about the Al-Qaeda and how they threatened India, saying that Kashmir is theirs. And so the threat from the Al-Qaeda remains quite real. Again, the threat from the Islamic State, many Indians joined, not very large numbers, but quite a few numbers, scores of them joined the ISIS. And many of the people who actually joined are people who were very well educated with technical skills. And sadly, some of them are from this very district from where I am speaking. So we need to be very alert about this radicalization. And we need to ensure that, there is real secularism is preserved. And like Partha Ghosh says, that Indian society and politics have yet to become socially and emotionally secular. So we have constitutional secularism, but we are yet to become socially and emotionally secular, and this is a problem. So the growth of religious extremism in India and abroad is also a major security challenge to India. To come to the last bit about internal security, I think the primary threat comes from left-wing or Maoist insurgency And the Maoists obviously justify violence as the means to capture state power. They glorify violence as the tool to overwhelm the existing socio-economic political structures. In 2012, the Home Minister of India had declared Maoist insurgency as the most formidable security challenge facing the country. But the threat has come down, but it is still alive. Just 2 days ago, 26 Maoists were killed in Kachra. So that shows that the threat is still alive. There are other insurgencies as well, particularly in the northeast. And just a couple of days ago, we saw how an colonel and his family were killed along with some other soldiers. But the Home Minister's data does show that the number of deaths in these insurgencies have come down substantially. And this has also been due to Bangladesh and Myanmar refusing to provide safe havens to these insurgents. Economic development in these regions, migration of these people to mainland India have provided job opportunities, and this has to help to bring down these insurgencies. Gilbert has already spoken at length about Kashmir, so I'm not going to delve into that at all. Then the last bit is about human security. If you look at our population growth and the fact that at COP26 nothing much happened, India's resource constraints are likely to deepen in the years ahead, and this would have implications for both national and human security. There's also risk of tensions among Indian states over groundwater distribution, or disputes over river, for instance, as well as regional tensions with Pakistan over the Indus Basin river water resources. Additionally, if you do not have enough water for irrigation, we could also plunge into food insecurity. So in conclusion, if you look at both the internal and external threats, I think we need to build a framework of cooperative security in our neighborhood. We need to manage tensions with China and Pakistan without compromising on our core national strategic interests. And this is so not only because they separately and together constitute a long-term threat to our security, but also because the stability of the region as a whole really depends on peace among these three countries. So we need to carry out internal as well as external balancing in terms of strengthening our defense, building a defense industrial base, as well as external balancing in getting partners who would support us, whether it's the Americans or the Russians or the Europeans, for instance. So the foremost task really for India is to overcome the challenge to its nation building and national security, and India's real autonomy in working out its destiny as an independent center of power would lie in its internal strength and cohesion. So only a politically stable, united, economically prosperous, and militarily strong India can seek to play its legitimate role in the world community, which is commensurate with its size and vast power potential, and deal with these very, very complex security challenges that it is facing. I'll stop here. Thank you for being a very patient audience. I think I've finished on time. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am, we are very much within the time. Thank you, Professor Dr. Uma, ma'am, for her analysis on mapping the India security challenges. Ma'am has highlighted the various security threat and political challenges for India, more specifically with regard to China, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. Ma'am have also touched upon the threat in international relation theory and spoke about the various insurgency issues in India, and also how the capability of any country can pose more threat. So thank you so much, ma'am, for such an enlightening lecture. Thank you, ma'am. So with this, we have come to the question and answer session. So it seems our audience are very enthusiastic. I have received so many questions. So first, I would like to invite Professor Srinivas Burra, sir. I got few questions for Professor Srinivas Burra, sir. Sir, so please tell me, should I read all the question and then you would like to respond, or should I read one by one? Because I believe there are few questions which are overlapping.
Yeah, I mean, it's good if you put 2-3 questions together. I think answer can be given.
Yes, sir. So, sir, the first question is how you interpret the dichotomy of good Taliban and bad Taliban? This is the first question. And the next question is, what are the challenges and military aspects for India in 21st century? And the next question is, how India should tackle the issue of spilling terrorism from Afghanistan? So last question I will read later. So maybe you could respond these three.
Okay, I think some of most probably I think they might be expecting answer from Professor Gilbert and Professor Uma on these questions, more of international relations and political issues. But probably I can touch upon few things about good Taliban and bad Taliban. I don't know whether, I mean, I'm not an expert on political science and international relations, but with my understanding, I don't know whether we can make that kind of a distinction between a good Taliban and bad Taliban. But in a political sense, yes, one makes a distinction in terms of based on their political positions, what they take, which may change from one situation to the other. So the fundamental issue, which I think I did not mention during my presentation, was that when I was talking about recognition and the Taliban holding the power, how a country is governed is primarily determined by the people of that country. Now, how they determine it is an important issue, but essentially, even if you go by the standard understanding of sovereign equality of states, it is a domestic affair. So, if even assuming that a government exists in a country which does not meet the general quote unquote standards of democracy and others, but that is the choice. I mean, that is a situation in a domestic in a country, because the danger of interfering into is that it goes to the extent of interfering in a military sense. There are several examples to show that how military interventions take place in the name of establishing democracy. So therefore, one has to be a little careful in getting into the domestic affairs of it, despite the fact that we need to have concerns about our neighbors or anywhere in the world, the kind of governance that takes place, which would have implications across the borders. But still, I think one has to be cautious in looking at the internal matters of any country. So therefore, I mean, it's a related question I'm trying to answer without getting into good or bad Taliban. So I only go by what are good or bad Taliban, good or bad state, failed states, terrorist states. These are all, I think, problematic categories, at least from the legal point of view. Sometimes we look at it, we find it difficult to say that who is a terrorist in international law now. I don't know. I mean, people do keep referring to something called terrorists, but there is nothing called terrorist categorization under international law other than few conventions dealing with specific aspects of terrorism. So these are all contested ones, both in higher and international law also. So it all depends more on how you look at or analyze or evaluate political positions of a particular regime, including Taliban part of it. But there is one comment which I think in the comment section is talks about obligation of India to protect in the Afghan context. I think somebody has written that thing. Now, just to answer that, probably is that yes, there is something called responsibility to protect, particularly keeping in view the civilians' point of view, that whether it is adversely any government, despite the fact that it is an elected government or whatever the government, their own government, but the government acts against its own people, whether there is an obligation from international community to respond to that situation is what led to the what you call formulation of what the concept called responsibility to protect. Now, it is arguably different from humanitarian intervention, which has been there, which still some states argue. But over a period of time, humanitarian intervention has been seen as completely a maligned concept. So something came up in the form of responsibility to protect, essentially looking at the state situation of civilians. If their fundamental rights are at stake by their own government, there is a responsibility to the international community as a whole to intervene. So it is slightly, arguably different from humanitarian intervention. But in essence, it generally reinforces what the essential idea behind humanitarian intervention. Now, these are all new terminologies, but if you look at the international legal framework, particularly the UN Charter and others, there are ways and means of dealing with it in accordance with legal standards in the form of intervention, including authorizations by the Security Council. So one has to be, at least personally, I'm reluctant to give a kind of a free hand to the concepts like responsibility to protect, because sometimes they significantly deviate from the well-established legal framework that is there as part of the UN Charter. So one has to be a little more careful in adopting those concepts like responsibility or obligation to protect. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. You have also answered the last question, which is put in the chat box with regard to the responsibility of India. Thank you so much, sir. Now, I would like to invite our next speaker, Professor Dr. Gilbert Sebastian. Sir, I got few questions for you. So let me read the first question. The question is, with respect to the situation in Kashmir, what are your views on the role state impunity plays in the exacerbations of any form of political resolution in Kashmir? Do you think that the policy in Pakistan occupied Kashmir has been different, and can India learn something from?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you for the question. Arnav Sharma.
Yes, sir. This question is from Arnav Sharma.
So, state impunity of the armed forces is a big problem, and it is written into the Armed Forces Special Powers Act that FIR cannot be filed. So that is a major issue actually. So they can break into places, they can arrest people, they can fire and kill, and still nothing can be done against them. So only mass protests are done when people get killed. Mass protests are done. So impunity is a very serious issue. So what I would say is that at least in districts, the non-border districts, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act can be gradually phased out. And then there should be inquiry, as it happened in Manipur, about to fix responsibility on the armed forces. We cannot give a free hand. If at all we want to keep Kashmir as Kashmiris as our own people, Kashmir as our land, then we have to do that. Secondly, the Pakistan occupied Kashmir, the Pakistan administered Kashmir, has got a different policy. That is true. There is no major atrocity like as it happened in the Kashmir Valley on the side of India, which is happening in the Pak administered Kashmir. So that is Gilgit-Baltistan. But then, the human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch have recorded that the civil and political rights in Gilgit-Baltistan is very strictly monitored, very strictly controlled. So it is not that they are free or they are just like any other Pakistani citizen. It is not like that. So so it is the resolution of this issue has to be there. And thirdly, the question which is asked is with respect to situation in Afghanistan, the involvement of Indian government in both civil and military affairs with the Afghan government. Does Indian side have an obligation to protect? Yeah, I think the responsibility to protect, R2P, this is an international norm, and it is not only the Indian government, but the whole international community has the responsibility to protect the citizens in Afghanistan. And nobody is actually willing to get into an armed conflict in Afghanistan, given the situation that Afghanistan is known as the graveyard of empires. But then the human rights situation of the women in Afghanistan is very dire. And therefore, it will be good if there is collective effort. And as Burra Srinivas was already saying, the foremost importance should be given to giving humanitarian aid to the Afghan people in an impending disaster, that is a famine which is going to come. So this much I will say about this question. Thank you.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much, sir. There is a two more question I will read for you. Why international community is silent over the issue of gross human rights violation in Pakistan occupied Kashmir? And the next question is that, should we resume a track to diplomacy with Pakistan? What are the important components can be added in track to diplomacy with Pakistan? Sir, you are muted.
Can you please read the second part of the question? The first part is about human rights violations in Pak-occupied Kashmir.
Yes, I will read it again.
Second one, can you just read it again? I couldn't catch it.
Yes. Second question is that, should we resume a track to diplomacy with Pakistan? What are the important components can be added in track to diplomacy with Pakistan? First question is regarding the human rights violation, sir.
Sure. Human rights violations in Pak-occupied Kashmir is there because, the first generation rights, as it is called, that is civil and political rights. The second generation rights are socio-economic rights. And the third generation rights are collective and solidarity rights. So the first generation rights, that is civil and political rights, itself is getting violated in Gilgit-Baltistan, that is the Pak-administered Kashmir, which is actually 35%, around 35% of the total Kashmir Valley. So 65% is with the Indian administered part, and 35% is with the Pakistan administered part. So there is human rights violation. And regarding track to diplomacy, I will leave it to Dr. Uma Purushothaman to answer this, because Uma Purushothaman is an international relations expert. I am more of a political science person. So diplomacy is always good. Track to diplomacy is always good, and we should always keep our channels of communication open for any government or even any movement. The channels of communication should always be open. That is what I would say. Track one, track two, everything. But I will leave that to Uma Purushothaman. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. So now I also have a question for Uma ma'am. So Uma ma'am, I will read for you.
Yeah. Please
Okay,
go
ma'am.
ahead.
Should India join BRI with China? Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka have joined the hands and causing China. If we look their new shift in their foreign policy, how this new alliance is going to be threat to India?
Which alliance?
Ma'am, I will read the question again.
Yeah.
Should India join BRI? If I'm not wrong, I think BRI is a Belt and Road Initiative. Should India join BRI with China? Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka have joined hands and causing China. If we look their new shift in their foreign policy, how this new alliance is going to be threat to India? Well, it's not clearly mentioned what kind of alliance.
Yeah.
So that's how the question is.
Well, I don't think there is any kind of alliance among Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Bangladesh as of now, at least. So I think that question, uh, I think that's out of question right now. The other is whether India should join the BRI. I think there are two views on this. One is, of course, that if the CPEC, which is now part of the BRI, if the CPEC can be moved away or taken out of the BRI, which is what India has been asking. Our primary problem vis-a-vis sovereignty is with regard to the CPEC being part of the BRI, right? So if other BRI projects, we have other issues, of course, in terms of whether the rules are transparent and, the idea that, there is so much debt which is given to countries and they don't know what they are in for when they come to it. So if those issues can be resolved, I think there is no harm since we are already part of the A2IB, which is funded majorly by the Chinese. I don't think there should be a problem to signing on. But first, these issues of sovereignty, CPEC, debt transparency, debts, all of this will have to be resolved. The reason I say that there is no harm in joining it is that the Chinese are the only people who really have the money to carry out these vast infrastructural projects across the world. We are not in a position to build huge infrastructure. So and in any case, the Chinese are going to go ahead with building those projects, so we might as well be part of it, and it might probably help our corporates as well to join with the Chinese in the BRI. But of course, if all these conditions, like I said, are dealt with. I think that was the question, right? So should India join the BRI?
Thank you, ma'am. Actually, the question was that next question was that there is a shift in the Chinese foreign policy about to causing and to have a friendly relationship with the Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh, and they are providing the huge financial assistance and military support. And how this alliance means, if you look at the attitude of our neighbors, immediate neighbors, something is not correct in their foreign policy, and that is the main issue that student have raised.
I understood. Oh, sorry, I didn't get the question when it was asked. Well, the thing is, the Chinese have a lot of money to spend. Do we have the capability? No, we do not. And like any small country, which is being ruled by two giants, Nepal, Bangladesh, all of these, Sri Lanka, they're all obviously trying to get the best that they can from both countries. And if they're getting more money from the Chinese, it's obvious that they will kind of shift towards the Chinese. And let me also add that our attitudes towards our smaller neighbors have not really helped in preventing the Chinese from getting some amount of influence on them. We've been very, big brotherly at times towards our smaller neighbors, and that has not helped to promote our cause vis-a-vis the Chinese. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I can see the last question in the chat box posted by Ajit Kumar Nandan. Ajit, I don't know to whom you wanted to ask this question. If you are here, you can ask yourself. Are you here, Ajit Kumar Nandan?
Yes, ma'am. Good afternoon, all my erudite faculty members and speakers. I have very little question, three questions. Any one speaker can answer my question. So my first question is, can you please elucidate the India's necklace of diamonds strategy, countering the string of pearls strategy of China? How far we have achieved the target and the loopholes which must be strengthened, especially in today's situation or the scenarios? This is my first question. Second one is, why our present leadership is mute even in mentioning the name of China, despite knowing despite knowing all the facts related to doklams, or recently we have seen photographs of villages built inside the territory of India and all. Do you think that it is the right time to strengthen or relook on the SARC and other geostrategic initiatives? And lastly, how including this in recent especially talking in our present regime, we have three important issues. We have seen that is Rohingyas issues we have seen, and the policy of NRCs which India has trying to implement, and their implications due to this, and the recent Afghanistan Taliban issues, ma'am. So in collaborating all these issues, how far you just think that our government is doing, and where we are going now, right now, and our, especially our foreign policies?
So any of the speaker can respond if they wish.
Let me try and answer the first three questions. The necklace of diamonds, we've been building strategic bases, whether it's in Singapore, in Indonesia, in countries like Oman, Seychelles, even the Chabahar port. All of this is basically a counter to, like he said, the string of pearls strategy of China, which is basically to have small bases surrounding India. And we have, I think, to a certain extent, gotten a number of countries to sign on to this strategy. We have also tried to get involved with Mongolia, with the Japanese, etc. on this. So it is part of our external balancing strategy. So in a sense, the idea is good, but the implementation is probably not as much as it should be, because again, the same problem of capabilities. Do we have the capabilities to build new naval bases in all of these countries, even though they are on they're willing to lend their naval bases to us? And that's something which will have to be looked at by policymakers in the years ahead. The loopholes are, I remember that after we had this agreement with the Seychelles Islands on the Assumption Islands, building a base there were protests by the local people. Ultimately, of course, it got, the protest died down or something. But I think the loophole is that, when we get into these arrangements with countries, we need to make sure that the citizens of those countries are also on board. These protests were because those people do not want to be caught between India and China. Why should we get between India and China's fight? And that's something which is a reasonable fear that people would have. So get the people of those of these countries as well as on board. I think that was a loophole. Present leadership is mute in mentioning the name of China. You don't have to name China. Everyone knows when the chief of defense staff says that we are ready for a two-front war. Obviously, he means that we're looking at China and Pakistan. So some things don't need to be talked about. We just need to act on what those challenges are. Is it a right time to strengthen SAARC and other geostrategic initiatives? And okay. It's always a good time to try and strengthen regional cooperation. But the point is that so long as India and Pakistan continue to bicker like this, I think even the smaller neighbors are not so enthusiastic about SAARC, precisely because they don't want to listen to India and Pakistan fighting at every forum that there is. Even though SAARC says that you should not discuss bilateral issues, inevitably it comes up, and we have been boycotting SAARC summits for a while now because of cross-border terrorism by the Pakistanis. The last question, I didn't really get it. Mentioning Rohingyas issue, NRC, Afghan, maybe one of the other speakers could look at the last question. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, ma'am, I was asking to know the views that these three important issues have encountered by India, that is Rohingya issues. We have seen it at large, and NRCs, the implications of the NRCs in the international forum, and the relations with the neighboring countries, and the recent shift in the regime in Afghanistan, that is Taliban. So overall, the picture is very much futile as we look in the foreign policy of India. So how should India respond to these challenges and strengthen our foreign policy or the diplomatic relations with especially with the neighboring countries, ma'am?
I just addressed the Rohingya issue because NRC and all would come under human rights. Probably Gilbert would be able to answer that better. Rohingya issue, I think we have kept a distance from the Rohingya issue, in the sense that we have tried not to alienate the military junta in Myanmar for two reasons. One, the primary reason being that if we do alienate the military junta, we would be literally handing over Myanmar on a plate to the Chinese. So we do not want that to happen. So that is why we have been more or less quiet about this. The other is, of course, that there is at least the government thinks that there is a real threat from the Rohingyas in terms of terrorist elements coming in. So that is why we've kept quiet about it. We are not talking. We are not getting too involved in this issue. The rest, I think, maybe Gilbert or someone could answer, because it is about NRC and all of that. So, which is not something that I touched upon at all.
Gilbert, you would like to answer on NRC, or I should say something about the NRC?
Narendra, you can say something about NRC.
Okay. Yeah, dear Ajit, actually, NRC is a domestic exercise, and the way it has been operationalized in especially in Northeast India, and the contentious law, that is the Citizenship Amendment Act 2019, and exclusion of certain religious communities in the ambit of the CAA, it smacks some kind of a vicious and conspiracy, or kind of a discriminatory attitude or treatment towards certain minority community. So whenever in throughout the world, it is a policy in international law that whenever you try to isolate the minority, the world communities, the international bodies, and the international human rights agency definitely attract, and they treat this kind of uh, behavior of the government, and as a policy, and as a pattern, and this is not acceptable in the new 21st century of the world, where we generally treat all our neighbors and the international community as a global village. So same things apply to the NRCs in Assam, and how the Rohingyas is being treated in the Myanmar also, the situation of the Ahmadiyya in Pakistan also, and the situation of Hazara and in Afghanistan also. So this is not the case of the India. You can see the throughout the world, whenever there is a crisis and discriminatory treatment against certain minority community, the international community definitely react sharply. That is the reason the government UN has discussed first time the Kashmir issue and Article 370 in Security Council. So I think you get the answer. Thank you, all the speakers. And no, the core issue of the this webinar was the challenges to peace. Why peace? Why peace is important in this South Asian region? Because if we have a stability, peace, we definitely expect some progress, prosperity, development, and cooperation. Uh, I can say firmly that uh, if that there will be no war between US and Canada. Similarly, the situation where there will be no war, I can say firmly that there will be no war between UK and France. Why we can't have such kind of peace, stability in South Asia? South Asia is very volatile. All the countries are fighting to each other. Why we can't have a, see, we don't know that that China has a so many dispute with the other country also. China has a dispute with the Japan also, and Vietnam also. China has a dispute with the Mongolia also. But despite so much differences and dispute, they are working together. They are cooperating, and the latest skirmishes and the armed conflicts in the northern area, especially in Ladakh sector, and recently in Uttarakhand also, and the Chinese illegitimate claim on Arunachal Pradesh. All these poses a great challenge to the peace, because the recent resolution of Chinese Parliament, yeah, the People Congress, has said that China will maintain its sovereignty at any cost. It means that the message is very clear. and loud to India. So I wish to say that why we can't have a stability and peace in the South Asian region. Same things apply to the Pakistan also, that despite so much differences, we are similar, we are very close, and we are neighbors. We have a historical legacy of cooperation. Why we continue this cooperation and mutual respect and uh, a good relation with a good neighbor. So this is the but the situation and the issues of terrorism, issues of the border conflict, issue of the cross border activities, smuggling, etc., etc., and recently uh, the issue of our interest, especially in Afghanistan. We have massive investment in Afghanistan. We cannot ignore, we cannot jeopardize the investment in Afghanistan. So obviously we have a concern that there should be a solution of the problem in Afghanistan, and uh, we have $1 million investment in Afghanistan. So we are looking for a solution so that we a stable and peaceful Afghanistan is in the interest of the India, because if we have a good relation with Afghanistan, we can also share and develop our economic activities and cultural activities also. And we should not forget that a majority of Afghanistan have a very positive and very nice feeling about India. This is another issue of the webinar. I am very happy to see that the webinar is very very successful to achieve its objective, to understand the challenges and threat, and the issue of the kind of uh, disturbance, especially with Nepal and Bangladesh also. It will be settled down in under the current leadership of the government, and government is fully competent and capable to handle these issues. Yes, territorial disputes are there, and but the thing is that we need some groundwork, we need some practical approach. For example, hardly we have any crisis management group with China, or hardly we have a hotline, or you can say the track to diplomacy kind of things with China. Why we have this kind of hostility and with China? And similarly, the Nepal is no longer to understand, and that is no longer to treat India as a big brother. Nepal issue is saying, government saying that we are two sovereign country and treat us like a sovereign partner. So issue is not here that who is big brother, who is younger brother. Issue is here that all are equal, and this is the based on the principle of democracy and equality. You have to treat all neighbor country equally if you want to behave as a responsible nation in the Asia. So the issue was the same, that when Irish and Scottish and in Europe also, they can achieve some kind of permanent solution of their problem. Same situation in the Japan and China also. There is a lot of dispute and differences over the certain island, and how to they are both the countries are claiming to these islands. Similarly, there are a lot of dispute with with in Middle East countries also. But there is no war in these countries, and I can give you the guarantee that there will be no war between the US and Canada, and they are living peacefully. Why we can't have such kind of guarantee in Asia? That's to say that there will be no war between India and China, and there will be no war between India and Pakistan. So this is the things, and I think that students have benefited a lot. And thank you so much for a very live and very useful, a very relevant questions, and I hope you have been satisfied with the answer given by our respected resource person. It is really nice to hear the Dr. Uma Purushothaman and Dr. Gilbert Sebastian for their wonderful lecture. Professor Srinivas Burra is also a competent it is my pleasure to have his company in this webinar. And sir, we would like to continue this engagement in future program also with the South Asian University. and especially you also. So with these words, I conclude, and now I am handing over the dice to the my colleague Dr. Anita Yadav for officially give the vote of thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nagarwal, for your concluding remarks. So, my dear friends, with this, we have come to the end of this one-day national webinar on challenges to peace, security, and international law in South Asia. I, Dr. Anita Yadav, Assistant Professor at Campus Law Center, University of Delhi, feel very privileged and honored to have been asked to propose vote of thanks in this webinar. So, on behalf of our professor in charge, Professor Dr. Alka Chawla ma'am, Dr. Naren Agarwal, director of this webinar, and from the entire community of the Campus Law Center, Faculty of Law, University of Delhi, I extend my sincere gratitude and thanks to all the eminent speakers for joining today, for taking out their time out of their busy schedule. So thank you so much, Professor Dr. Srinivas Burra sir, Professor Dr. Gilbert Sebastian sir, and Professor Dr. Uma ma'am for taking out time and engaging to all the audience on this very burning issues. Finally, I would like to take this opportunity to thank all the enthusiastic participants who have joined this program, who are watching this program live. Thank you once again for making this event successful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Yadav. And now, with these words, I officially conclude the webinar. And thank you, Gilbert. Thank you, Uma ma'am, and thank you, Srinivasan sir. This is the end of the session. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.